Hey guys, tonight we delve into a place where the fear of what might happen after you died was so profound, they took precautions that seem utterly bizarre and honestly deeply terrifying to us now. Imagine a small village, huddled against the wind and rain, its houses low and dark, tucked away in a valley so remote that news from the outside world arrives months late, if at all. The air here always carries a faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and a quiet hum of resignation hangs over everything. Life is hard. Survival is a daily grind against fickle weather, poor harvests, and the constant silent threat of illness. But it's not just the living they worry about. It's the journey to the afterlife, and specifically, what happens just before that journey truly begins. Because in this village, when someone seemed to stop breathing, when the doctor, or more likely, the local wise woman, declared them gone, the fear wasn't that they'd be lonely in the grave. The fear was that they weren't gone at all. And so with grim efficiency, they developed a custom. They nailed the coffin shut while you were still inside, maybe still alive. Yeah, you probably won't survive this one without feeling a few shivers, or at least needing to check your pulse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always wild to see how far these stories travel across time and space. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at the edge of the village as dusk settles, the single track you followed for miles dissolving into a muddy path between fields. Smoke curls lazily from stone chimneys, a sign of warmth and life. Yet an unnerving stillness hangs in the air. The houses are squat, built of rough stone and timber, their roofs thatched and sagging. There are no welcoming lights spilling onto the path, no sounds of laughter or revelry, just silence, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant bleating of a sheep or the rustle of something unseen in the tall grass. You pull your cloak tighter, the evening chill biting deeper than it should. This isn't just isolation, it feels guarded, secretive. As you walk deeper into the cluster of buildings, you notice small, almost unadorned crosses planted outside some doorways. Not ornate markers of faith, but simple, stark shapes that seem less about devotion and more about warding something off. Children stop their quiet games and stare, their faces pale and unsmiling. Adults eye you from windows or the shadows of doorways, their expressions wary, unreadable. There's no friendly greeting, no offer of a bed for the night. You are an outsider, and outsiders here are not welcomed. They are tolerated, perhaps, until they leave, or until they understand. You finally reach the village common, a small, uneven patch of ground dominated by a sturdy, if plain, church. Beside the church, under the shadow of a few gnarled trees, is the graveyard. It's not large, the stones tilted and worn by centuries of weather, but it's here that you first glimpse the village's peculiar custom. The newest graves, marked by freshly turned earth, have something unusual about them. They are not just mounds of soil. Heavy stones are placed strategically on top, or sometimes thick wooden planks are laid across, secured with pegs driven deep into the ground. It looks less like marking a grave and more like pinning something down, preventing something from getting out. This isn't a practice common in most places you've heard of. Graveyards are usually places of rest, solemnity, perhaps sorrow, but not this palpable sense of restraint. You feel a prickle of unease crawl up your spine. Why would they need to secure their dead so thoroughly? What were they afraid of? The local elder, a man with eyes like chipped flint and hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, eventually approaches you. He doesn't offer his name, just regards you with that same unsettling wariness. You ask about the graves, about the stones and the planks. His face, already lined and grim, hardens further. He speaks slowly, his voice raspy, as if unused to talking about such things with strangers. We take precautions, he says, his gaze fixed on the newest mound of earth. The sickness, it plays tricks. He speaks of people falling ill, their bodies racked with fever or wasting away with a mysterious consumption. They grow weak, their breathing shallow, their pulses faint. Sometimes they seem to fade entirely, their bodies cold and still. To all appearances, they are gone, dead. But the elder speaks of stories, of whispers passed down through generations, of those who were laid out for burial only to stir hours later, of the terror of waking in the darkness, the cold seeping into your bones, surrounded by the silence that isn't silence, but the muffled sounds of life continuing above ground. The absolute, unimaginable horror of realizing you are in a coffin, underground, buried. He doesn't elaborate on how they determine death here, but you gather it's based on simple observations. No breath on a mirror, no heartbeat felt against the chest, cold limbs. These methods, common enough historically, especially in isolated areas without access to physicians, are notoriously unreliable. A mainstream historical fact. Throughout much of medieval and early modern history, distinguishing a true death from a deep coma, a cataleptic state, or severe paralysis was incredibly difficult with the limited medical knowledge available. People were genuinely afraid of being buried alive, a fear known as taphophobia, and historical records contain numerous accounts, both credible and folklore, of measures taken to prevent this, from burial bells, strings attached to a bell above ground, to waiting periods. But those were typically about preventing burial until death was certain. This village seems to have skipped a step, or rather, added a terrifying one. Their fear isn't just of being buried alive, it's of what happens next. The elder speaks of the soul lingering, perhaps, or a body simply regaining its functions after a deep, death-like collapse. He doesn't use words like vampire or undead specifically, but the implication is clear. They are afraid of the body stirring in the grave, of something coming back. And the ultimate prevention, the finality, is the coffin itself. Once they are laid in, he explains, his voice barely a whisper, and the prayers are said, we close the lid, and we secure it, firmly. He makes a motion with his hand, like driving a nail. That's it. That's the custom. The moment the deceased is placed in the wooden box, perhaps still warm, perhaps just deep in a coma, the lid is fastened, nailed shut, not just sealed with latches or screws, but physically nailed. There's no waiting period in the house, no vigil where loved ones watch for signs of life. Once the declaration, however uncertain, is made, the process begins. The preparation, the placing in the coffin, the nailing, the carrying to the grave, and the burial. It's a swift, brutal efficiency born of profound fear. You try to imagine it, being weak, feverish, fading in and out of consciousness. The cold floor beneath you, the smell of beeswax and wood. Then, strong hands lifting you, placing you in a tight wooden box. The lid coming down, plunging you into darkness. The sound of a hammer driving nails into wood, loud, final, sealing you in. The muffled thud of earth hitting the lid. The realization, maybe gradual, maybe sudden, that you are trapped. What kind of screams would erupt in that moment? What kind of frantic scrabbling against wood? Would anyone hear? Would anyone listen? The thought makes you shudder uncontrollably. It's a kind of horror that goes beyond simple death. It's the horror of agency stripped away, of being conscious during your own interment. A truly dark thought to lull you to sleep, I know. Sorry, not sorry. There's a strange, almost perverse logic to it from their perspective. If the death is final, the nailing changes nothing about the ultimate outcome. If it's not final, well, better for that stirring to happen inside the box than to have a seemingly dead body suddenly sit up in the church, or worse, the family home. It's a harsh preventative measure against a terrifying possibility, one that their limited understanding of life and death made all too real. Historians still argue whether such extreme, routine practices of immediately and permanently sealing coffins before absolute certainty of death were widespread or merely isolated occurrences, perhaps exaggerated in later accounts. Some scholars believe such customs were rare anomalies born from specific local crises or deep-seated superstitions, while others suggest they might have been more common in areas hit hard by plagues or illnesses that caused death-like states. with the accounts simply not surviving in the historical record. Was this village unique, or simply one of the few where this desperate measure was recorded or remembered? It's hard to say definitively. You can almost hear the sound of that hammer in the quiet night air. A rhythmic, chilling beat. Thud, 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 sealing a fate. You wonder about the people who performed this grim task. The carpenter who built the sturdy, necessary boxes. The family members who placed their loved ones inside. The person who held the nail. The person who swung the hammer. How did they live with the possibility? Did they tell themselves it was always necessary? Did they ever pause, hammer raised, wondering if the faint sound they heard was just the wind or something else? This wasn't just a practical measure. It was imbued with ritual, born of a specific kind of fear and a desperate desire for control in a world where so much was uncontrollable. The weather, the harvest, disease, death itself. The one thing they could control was the finality of the burial. A quirky tidbit about medieval burial customs. While nailing coffins shut was certainly not the norm for preventing premature burial, other unusual practices existed. For instance, in some regions it was considered unlucky to wear shoes in the coffin, so the deceased were often buried barefoot. Or in others, personal items, even sometimes pets, were included in the coffin, not just for comfort in the afterlife, but perhaps also as a form of company to deter the newly deceased from feeling the need to return and bother the living. This village's practice of immediate, physical sealing feels distinct from simple grave goods or barefoot burials. It's an active, violent act of containment. As you stand there, the silence of the village pressing in, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke suddenly feels heavier, more profound. You understand now why the air feels so still, why the people look so guarded. They live not just with the presence of death, but with the unnerving possibility of its temporary absence. And they have chosen a grim, final solution. The elder finally turns his gaze from the graveyard to you, his eyes holding a depth of weariness and fear that makes your own unease solidify into something cold and hard. He doesn't invite you in, doesn't offer food or shelter. He just gestures vaguely back the way you came. Best be on your way, he rasps. The night, it holds secrets here. You don't argue. The story of this village, of its strange, terrifying custom, has already seeped into your bones. The image of that hammer falling, sealing a potential life away in the dark, will stay with you. It's a stark reminder of how fear, combined with ignorance and isolation, can twist the most fundamental human rituals into something horrifying. This is just the beginning of understanding the village that nailed coffins shut before the person died. There's much more to uncover about why this became their reality and what happened because of it. You turn from the elder, the chill in the air now feeling like a physical weight. His gaze follows you until you round the corner of the church, leaving the graveyard behind. The path back feels longer, the silence of the village more oppressive than before. You can feel the weight of their fear pressing in, a tangible thing woven into the fabric of the place like the smoke from their chimneys or the dampness of the soil. This isn't just a strange local custom. It's the product of generations living with a specific, profound dread. As you walk, you consider what he told you, the sickness that plays tricks, the bodies that seem dead but might not be, the fear of stirring in the grave. It seems almost medieval in its simplicity and its brutality, and in many ways it is. Think about it. We live in a time where death is often diagnosed by electronic monitors, brain scans, or sophisticated medical tests. We have hospitals, trained doctors, and protocols. They had observation. Imagine yourself in their shoes centuries ago in a place like this. Medical knowledge as we understand it is practically non-existent. If someone collapses, their pulse undetectable to the touch, their breathing shallow or seemingly stopped, their skin cold, by all common signs available to them, that person is dead. There's no stethoscope to hear a faint heartbeat deep within the chest, no way to measure brain activity, no understanding of conditions that can cause temporary paralysis or catatonia, making a person appear lifeless for hours, even days. Conditions like catalepsy, for instance, were poorly understood. Someone suffering from a severe cataleptic state might appear completely rigid, with an extremely slow pulse and breathing so shallow it's almost invisible. To an observer without medical training, they would seem dead. Other illnesses, severe fevers, certain types of poisoning, even extreme exhaustion or shock, could induce deep comas or states of suspended animation. Without the ability to accurately distinguish these states from true death, the fear of premature burial wasn't just a spooky story, it was a genuine, albeit rare, possibility. This reality gave birth to the widespread historical fear known as taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. It was a phobia shared across many cultures and time periods, leading to all sorts of fascinating and sometimes equally bizarre preventative measures. People requested to have their wrists slit or a stake driven through their heart before burial, just to be absolutely sure. Some wills stipulated long waiting periods before interment, sometimes up to a week, with watchers hired to constantly monitor the body for any sign of life. Special coffins were invented, equipped with bells on strings attached to the hands of the deceased, hence the phrase "saved by the bell," supposedly, although that's likely an urban myth. Air tubes or even escape hatches, though how a weakened, recently deceased person was supposed to utilize these from 6 feet under remains a practical mystery. A mainstream historical fact. The widespread fear of premature burial in the 18th and 19th centuries led to numerous patents for safety coffins designed to allow the occupant to signal for help or even escape if they awoke after burial. These range from complex contraptions with bells and flags to simpler air vents. The villagers you encountered didn't seem to bother with waiting periods or safety features. Their solution was direct, brutal, and final: immediate physical containment. Why? This speaks to something deeper than just a practical fear of waking up underground. It suggests a fear of what might emerge if the body did stir. This is where superstition and folklore weave into the narrative. In many historical cultures, beliefs about the dead were complex and often fearful. The line between life and death was sometimes seen as porous, and the transition not always smooth. There were fears of the soul not leaving the body properly, or of the body itself being reanimated by malevolent forces. Stories of revenants, wraiths, and various forms of the undead were common in folklore long before modern vampire myths took hold. For these villagers, isolated and likely relying on age-old oral traditions and local superstitions, the potential for a body to come back after death might not have been just a medical anomaly, like a coma, but something more sinister. Perhaps they believed that if a body stirred in the grave, it wasn't the original person waking up, but something else, a restless spirit unable to find peace, or worse, something actively malevolent taking control of the corpse. This might explain the need for absolute finality. Nailing the coffin shut wasn't just preventing an escape, it was preventing an emergence. It was a way to keep it contained, whatever it might be in their belief system. A reanimated corpse, a vessel for a demon, or simply a profound disruption of the natural order of death. Think about the psychology of it. In a community where illness could sweep through and decimate families, where the forces of nature felt unpredictable and often hostile, control over death might have felt like the only control they had. If they couldn't prevent death, they could at least ensure its finality, preventing the terrifying possibility of it being temporary or incomplete in a way that threatened the living. The act of nailing the coffin shut becomes a ritualistic reinforcement of that control, a desperate assertion of agency against the overwhelming power of mortality and the unknown. It also highlights the role of isolation. If this village had been closer to a city or on a major trade route, they might have had more exposure to different ideas about death and burial, or perhaps even infrequent visits from traveling healers or barber surgeons who, while still primitive by our standards, might have possessed slightly better diagnostic skills than the local elder or wise woman. But tucked away in their valley, they were reliant on inherited knowledge, passed down fears, and local experience. If a series of deaths had occurred where individuals did seem to stir before burial, perhaps victims of the same specific illness causing catalepsy, it would have cemented this fear and validated their extreme response. Confirmation bias at its most terrifying. Imagine the community discussions about this. Not formal debates, but quiet, fearful conversations around the fire at night. Remember old Thomas? They said he was gone, but the wife swore she heard something from the annex before sunrise. They buried him quick after that, didn't they? Or little Mary faded so fast, looked gone for 2 days, but the cat kept hissing at the corner where she lay. Such stories, embellished and passed down, would create a powerful collective anxiety, reinforcing the need for drastic measures. A quirky tidbit you might find interesting or just plain weird. In some historical accounts, particularly from Eastern Europe, there are tales of burying individuals face down or even dismembering the corpse, specifically to prevent the dead from returning as vampires or other restless spirits. This wasn't about preventing premature burial, but about incapacitating a potentially malevolent entity. The village's nailing practice feels like a blend of these two fears, preventing a premature awakening that they believe might lead to a malevolent returner, or simply ensuring that if it does stir, it remains trapped. It's less gruesome than dismemberment, perhaps, but the thought of being conscious during the nailing, well, let's not dwell on that too much before bedtime. Historians still argue whether the belief in restless dead, sometimes labeled as vampires in folklore studies, directly fueled specific burial practices like this village's extreme method, or if the fear of premature burial was the primary driver, with subsequent interpretations in folklore lore then woven around the practical, though horrifying measure. Did the fear of being buried alive lead to the nailing? And then the community explained why this was necessary by inventing or emphasizing stories of the restless dead? Or did a pre-existing fear of the undead lead them to adopt the nailing as the ultimate containment strategy? It's a chicken or egg scenario rooted in the complex interplay of folk belief, limited knowledge, and traumatic experience. Consider the alternative solutions they didn't employ. They didn't build a special house where bodies were kept and observed for a week. They didn't invest in elaborate signaling systems. Their choice was simple, available, and effective from their perspective. Wood, nails, hammer, finality. This suggests a pragmatic, perhaps even desperate, approach born of limited resources and immediate, terrifying perceived need. The speed of it, as the elder implied, is also key. Once the declaration was made, the process was swift. No lingering uncertainty, no agonizing wait. Just the grim task performed, and then the burial. It's almost as if they couldn't bear the suspense of waiting and watching, praying for a sign of life but dreading it even more, given what they believed might happen. The economic reality of village life would also play a part. Resources were scarce. A lengthy vigil would take people away from essential tasks like farming, animal care, or crafting. Fancy safety coffins were likely beyond their means and knowledge. Nailing a standard wooden box shut? That required only basic carpentry skills, readily available materials, wood, nails, and a strong arm. It was a solution born of necessity, fear, and limited options, a grim efficiency. The image of the carpenter lingers. He built the boxes, sturdy enough for their purpose. Did he ever hesitate measuring a child's length, knowing the likely fate inside? Did the rhythmic sound of his hammer echo in his nightmares? Was there a specific type of nail, chosen for its strength and permanence? Probably just whatever was available, hammered deep to resist any potential internal struggle. The simple tools of life twisted to serve the finality of a feared death. You find yourself looking back towards the village as you reach the edge of the tree line. The smoke still curls, the faint sounds of distant sheep still carry on the wind. But now, knowing what you know, the peace feels fragile, underscored by a constant low hum of anxiety. Every shadow seems deeper. Every creak of a branch sounds like a potential movement in the dark. You understand the guarded looks of the villagers, the stark crosses by the doors. They are living in a state of perpetual defense, not just against the natural world, but against a feared return from the grave. This deep-seated fear, this lack of understanding, this isolation, these were the ingredients that brewed their unique and terrifying custom. And understanding the roots of their fear is the first step to understanding how deeply it shaped their lives, and what might have happened when their grim precaution was put to the ultimate test. You've internalized the fear now, the logic of their terror, however warped it seems. You understand why they did it, this drastic final measure. But understanding the general fear is one thing. Imagine living through the specific instance, the singular event that might haunt the village, the story whispered low around fires, the one that validates or perhaps eternally condemns their practice. There must have been a moment, a specific case that cemented this custom or perhaps tested it in the most terrifying way possible. Let's take you there. Step into a different season, maybe late autumn. The air bites sharper, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Leaves crunch underfoot. Their brief, vibrant lives over. The village is quiet, but there's a different kind of stillness tonight. A heavy one. News travels fast here, carried on worried glances and hushed tones. Someone has fallen ill. It wasn't sudden, not like a lightning strike, but a rapid decline. Old Alara. Everyone knew Alara. She wasn't ancient, but old enough to have seen several harsh winters and buried her share of kin. She was the one who knew the best herbs for coughs, who could mend a torn net like magic, whose laughter could sometimes be heard echoing from her small cottage near the stream. Respected, liked, and now she lay still. The sickness that took her wasn't like the usual agues or coughs. It started with a fever, yes, but then a strange lethargy, a slowing down. Her breathing became shallow, her pulse faint. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin waxy and cool. Days blurred into one another. The elder was called. He sat by her bedside, his face grim, feeling for a pulse that was barely there, watching for a breath that seemed absent. The women who cared for her spoke in whispers of the unnatural stillness, the way her limbs had stiffened, the eerie quietness that had fallen over her body. After what felt like an eternity of watching, of straining to see a flicker of life, the elder made the pronouncement. She was gone. The words, though expected, landed like stones in the room. Grief was immediate, a heavy cloak. But beneath the grief, for those who knew the village's ways, was the familiar, cold knot of dread. The process began with grim efficiency. There was no prolonged wake, no time for weeping endlessly over the body. The fear dictated speed. The carpenter was summoned. You can hear his heavy footsteps approaching through the mud, the clink of his tools. He doesn't need instructions. He knows what's required. A box, sturdy, made for one purpose. He works quickly, the rhythmic rasp of his saw cutting through the quiet air. The smell of fresh cut pine filling the small cottage. It's a smell usually associated with building new things, with life, but here it's the scent of finality. Alara's body was prepared with haste, cleaned, dressed in her simple burial clothes. The women moved with practiced, somber efficiency, their faces masks of sorrow and fear. They avoid looking too closely, perhaps, or maybe they look too closely, searching for a sign they dread to find. A twitch, a shudder, a sudden breath. There was nothing. Or was there? In the dim light filtering through the small window, did a shadow play a trick on their eyes? Did a draft make her linen shifts stir? The mind, fueled by fear, can conjure anything. The carpenter arrives with the coffin, the wood still raw, smelling of the forest. It's carried in, heavy and cumbersome. The space suddenly feels smaller, colder. They gently, perhaps too quickly, lift Alara's body and place her inside. Her limbs are stiff, yes, consistent with death. But sometimes catalepsy can cause that rigidity too. The thought, unspoken, hangs in the air like the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light. What if? The moment arrives. The lid is placed on the coffin. Darkness descends upon Alara. The women step back, tears streaming freely now. The men of the village, summoned to carry the coffin, stand ready, their faces set. And the carpenter raises his hammer. This is the core of the terrifying story. Not just the death, but the act. The sound of the first nail being struck. It's not a gentle tap, it's a deliberate, firm blow. You can imagine the sound echoing in the small room, in the silent village, perhaps even in the ears of the person within the box. Thud. The nail bites into the wood, securing the lid. One nail, two, three. They aren't just sealing a box, they are sealing a fate. They are nailing shut the possibility of return, of stirring, of waking. What if, just as the third nail sank home, there was a sound from within? A muffled gasp? A scrabbling noise? What if, at the periphery of someone's vision, the corner of the coffin lid seemed to shift fractionally? The stories say nothing of this, of course. The official narrative is clean, brutal, and final. The body was prepared, placed in the coffin, and nailed shut. Done. But in the quiet hours, when the wind howls round the eaves and the fire casts dancing shadows, doesn't the mind wander? Didn't someone somewhere later that night or weeks after suddenly sit bolt upright in bed, hearing that sound in their memory? The sound of the hammer, and wonder? Just wonder? This specific instance with Alara becomes the village's touchstone. It reinforces their custom. Perhaps Alara's death was particularly unnerving, mimicking the feared state perfectly. Perhaps there were signs, subtle enough to be dismissed by frightened minds eager for finality, but lingering enough to fuel future anxieties and justify their extreme actions. The story, whether true or embellished, serves a purpose. It explains why they must be so certain, so final. It transforms the abstract fear of waking up buried into a concrete possibility they believe they must actively prevent. Think about the psychology of the people performing this act. They are not inherently cruel, you tell yourself. They are motivated by fear, by a desperate need for control, by inherited custom. But still, the act is brutal. The sound of the hammer, the knowledge of what they are doing, sealing a human being into darkness with no chance of escape. It's a violation, even if they believe it's necessary. And doing it to someone like Alara, someone known and loved, makes it all the more tragic. A mainstream historical fact. While most cultures throughout history had rituals surrounding death and burial, the practice of physically restraining or damaging the body, before signs of decomposition or certainty of death, beyond immediate medical markers, was extremely rare and usually linked to very specific fears, such as preventing vampirism or the return of malevolent spirits, rather than solely preventing premature burial. This village's practice, combining the fear of premature burial with the physical constraint at the time of initial death declaration, seems unusual in its directness and apparent universality within their community. The specific details of Alara's illness fade into folklore. Was it a known fever? Some strange affliction? Was it something unique, something that truly mimicked death in a way they had never seen before? Or was it something mundane that their fear amplified into a monstrous possibility? Historians still argue whether specific regional illnesses or genetic conditions that cause catatonic states played a significant role in fueling historical fears of premature burial in isolated communities, or if the fear was primarily a product of limited medical knowledge and widespread folklore about the restless dead. It's another one of those loops. Did the illness create the fear, or did the pre-existing fear interpret the illness in a terrifying way? Imagine the conversation afterward, after Alara was buried, after the last shovel of earth covered her grave. They wouldn't dwell on the gruesome details, not openly. They would speak of her life, perhaps, but the unspoken knowledge of how she was buried would hang heavy. And maybe, just maybe, someone would recall something small, something insignificant at the time. A flutter of her eyelid they thought was a trick of the light. A faint warmth remaining in her hand as they placed it on her chest. An almost imperceptible sigh. Little details that, in retrospect, become terrifying omens. This is where the folklore is born, isn't it? From the gaps between what happened and what people feared had happened. The story of Alara's death becomes the cautionary tale, the justification. Remember Alara, the elder might say years later, when a young man questions the brutal custom? She looked gone, truly gone. And we did what we had to do. Better safe than, well, you know. The safety here is not for the deceased, but for the living. It's a psychological safety, a grim reassurance that they have done everything in their power to contain a potential threat. The act of nailing the coffin shut is a ritual boundary, a physical barrier against the unknown horrors of the threshold between life and death as they understand it. It's a way of saying to the universe, stay where you are, do not cross back over in a way we cannot comprehend. And the carpenter? the one who performed the act? He is a central, silent figure in this village's horror. He is the instrument of their fear, the one whose hands carry out the final, irreversible step. Did he ever misjudge? Did a nail bend? Did his hammer slip? Such mundane details become loaded with dread when linked to this task. A quirky tidbit related to carpenters and death. In some folk traditions, carpenters who made coffins were viewed with a mix of respect and fear, sometimes being associated with ill omens or having a liminal status between the living and the dead, perhaps because of their intimate involvement in the final container of a human body. One hopes this carpenter didn't charge extra for soul containment services. The silence after the hammering must have been profound. The sound stops, but the echoes vibrate in the wood of the coffin, in the ears of the villagers, in the very earth that will soon receive the box. Alara, the woman who laughed, who mended nets, who knew herbs, is now just the potential horror contained within a wooden box, secured by iron nails hammered deep. This single terrifying instance, whether it unfolded exactly as feared or remained a chilling possibility born of collective anxiety, solidifies the village's commitment to its grim practice. It becomes a part of their identity, a dark secret they carry, a heavy burden passed down through generations. The fear of waking up inside that box, in the absolute darkness, the sound of the earth being thrown upon the lid, the nails holding you fast. It's the stuff of nightmares. And for this village, it was the nightmare they actively sought to prevent, even if the prevention itself was a horror of its own kind. They traded one terrifying possibility for another, perhaps equally terrifying, certainty. And that certainty, that cold, final thud, is the sound that defines this village's history. The cold knot of dread left by Alara's story, or any story like hers, tightens the invisible bonds of their custom around the villagers. You feel it too. It's not just the final, horrifying act of the nailing. It's the entire process surrounding it, born from a desperate need for certainty in a world that offered none. The nailing isn't an isolated event. It's the grim punctuation mark at the end of a series of rituals, checks, and perhaps even preventative measures, all aimed at confronting this specific, primal fear. So let's look at the how beyond the hammer. What did they do in those terrifying hours or days between the moment someone seemed to die and the final, irrevocable sealing of the coffin? Because surely they didn't just see a still body and immediately reach for the nails. That would be madness, even for a village gripped by this specific phobia. No, there were protocols, grim routines established over time, refined by fear and experience. Imagine yourself as one of the villagers tasked with attending to the deceased. It's a heavy duty, often falling to the older women. The body is laid out, washed, dressed. This is standard in many cultures, a final act of respect. But here, respect is intertwined with vigilance. As they perform these tasks, their eyes are searching constantly. Is there a flicker? A breath against the cold air? A subtle change in color? One of the most common, albeit often unreliable, historical methods for checking for signs of life involved a mirror or polished metal held near the mouth or nose. Does it fog? Is there condensation? You can picture a nervous hand holding a small, tarnished piece of metal, perhaps a polished spoon or a scrap of tin, above the seemingly lifeless face, everyone holding their breath, staring intently. The silence stretches, broken only by the crackling fire or the wind outside. A single tiny puff of condensation would bring immense relief, though perhaps also a different kind of dread, the dread of the illness itself, which was still very much real. But at least you wouldn't have buried them alive. Another method? Listening, pressing an ear to the chest, straining to hear a heartbeat, placing a hand on the neck or wrist, feeling for a pulse. In a quiet room, you might hear the blood rushing in your own ears, making it even harder to be sure. Was that a faint thump, or just your own hopeful, terrified heart mimicking the sound? The uncertainty was a torment in itself. Modern medicine gives us stethoscopes, EKGs, sophisticated ways to measure life signs. They had their senses clouded by grief, fear, and limited knowledge of the human body. Sometimes folk practices involved less gentle methods, pricking the skin to see if there was a reaction, holding a flame close to the body to see if they flinched. These weren't acts of cruelty, but of desperation. They needed some undeniable sign of life. You can imagine the arguments, the disagreements. I saw a tremor. No, that was just the light. His skin felt warm for a moment. The fire was too close. Every observation was filtered through the lens of their overriding anxiety. There might have been a waiting period, not hours, perhaps not days, but a set time they had to wait before proceeding to the final stage. This is a mainstream historical fact. Waiting periods, sometimes called vigils or wakes, serve multiple purposes culturally, including mourning, saying farewell, and crucially, providing time for death to be confirmed. In some historical contexts, bodies might be held for 24, 48, or even 72 hours before burial, partly to allow for signs of decomposition or undeniable signs of death to appear. While our village might not have had the luxury of waiting days, if decomposition was slow or the fear was high, a mandated period of waiting, maybe overnight or for a full day, would have been a logical, albeit nerve-wracking, step in their process. You sit with the body, you watch, you wait, your anxiety gnawing at you with every passing second. Did they set up shifts? Did people volunteer, or were they assigned this dreadful duty? Consider the psychological toll this takes. Watching someone you knew and loved, waiting for them to decompose or show some ghastly sign of finality, all while terrified they might suddenly wake up in front of you, would be an unbearable burden. It's a twisted kind of wake. Less about celebrating a life and more about confirming its absolute end in the most terrifying way possible. Beyond checking and waiting, did they have any beliefs about preventing this state in the first place? Perhaps certain herbs placed in the sick room or on the body? Charms worn by the living to ward off the illness that mimic death? Prayers or incantations? Folk medicine and superstition often intertwined. Maybe they believed that if someone died peacefully, without struggle, they were less likely to enter this terrifying state. So perhaps calming rituals were performed during someone's final hours, not just for comfort, but as a desperate preventative measure against premature burial. A quirky tidbit: in some cultures and historical periods, there were elaborate rituals surrounding death meant to confuse or deter the soul or spirit from returning, sometimes involving winding paths to the grave or burying the body facing away from the village. This village's focus seems less on the spirit returning as a malevolent entity like a vampire, and more on the body physically reanimating, but the fear of the unnatural return is a common thread. Did they carry the coffin by a specific route, turn it around 3 times before burial? It's possible their rituals had layers, some about confirming physical death, others about ensuring spiritual or unnatural return was prevented too. The transition from the vigil to the final sealing must have been tense. If they had waited, if they had performed their checks and still found no signs of life, the decision to proceed would be made with heavy hearts, but perhaps a desperate sense of necessity. The coffin would be brought out, the body placed inside, and then the lid. This is where their specific defining ritual kicked in with full force. The checks weren't enough. The waiting wasn't enough. The fear demanded a more absolute guarantee. The nails weren't just about securing the lid for transport. They were the physical embodiment of their determination that whatever was inside stayed inside permanently, regardless of what happened next. Historians still argue whether the historical fear of premature burial was significantly overblown compared to the actual incidence of such events, or if conditions like catalepsy, coma, and severe fainting spells were genuinely common enough in populations with poor nutrition, limited medical knowledge, and specific regional illnesses to fuel such widespread and intense anxieties. Was the fear justified by reality? Or was it a monstrous folklore born of ignorance and dread that then shaped their reality? Think about the tools themselves: the hammer, the nails. Simple, everyday items, but used in this context, they become instruments of a terrible finality. The sound, as we discussed, is central to the horror. It's loud, definitive, irreversible. There's no quiet closing, no gentle lowering of a lid. It's a violent act performed out of fear. Perhaps the village had different levels of certainty. For a known illness with clear stages ending in undeniable death signs, like rigor mortis setting in significantly, which is a relatively reliable, though not foolproof, sign of death, maybe the checks were quicker, the waiting period shorter. But for deaths that seem sudden, or where the body remained eerily fresh and supple for longer than expected, or where the illness was mysterious, those might be the cases that prompted the most rigorous checks, the longest waits within their fearful limits, and the most fervent, perhaps even excessive, hammering. The preventative angle is fascinating because it speaks to a desire for control even before death appears. Did they have specific foods they ate or avoided when someone was ill? Did they believe that keeping the sick person awake was important to ensure they didn't slip into a death-like slumber? It's easy to imagine desperate families trying anything: loud noises, strange remedies, constant vigilance, hoping to prevent their loved ones from presenting with the terrifying symptoms that preceded the nailing. It's a cycle of fear, isn't it? The illness strikes, causing symptoms that resemble death. The villagers, steeped in the lore of premature burial, interpret these symptoms through their lens of fear. This fear dictates increasingly extreme rituals and checks. The perceived failure of these checks, or the inability to be absolutely certain, leads to the final, irreversible act of nailing. And that act, with its terrifying implications, reinforces the need for the rituals in the first place. It's a self-perpetuating system built on anxiety and a lack of sure knowledge. You can almost hear the desperate logic: we must do this, because the alternative is unthinkable. And since we do this, it proves the alternative is a real threat we have successfully contained. Imagine the carpenter again. He's not just a craftsman, he's the village's executioner of uncertainty. His hands perform the deed that everyone fears but deems necessary. Does he have his own rituals? Does he say a prayer before he starts hammering? Does he dread certain types of wood or certain times of day for the task? You can almost smell the fresh pine and the metallic tang of iron nails as he selects them, each one destined to prevent a horror by enacting another. He's probably the least popular person at parties, assuming they had parties. Oh, hey Bob, still nailing people shut? The sheer practicality of it is also unsettling. How many nails? Were they standard size? Did they use iron or wood pegs? Details that seem mundane in any other context become freighted with morbid significance here. Each nail is a barrier, each hammer blows a final statement. It solidifies the box, yes, but more importantly, it solidifies the village's defense against its greatest fear. Their burial ground wouldn't just be a place of sorrow, it would be a place charged with latent anxiety. Every grave would represent a life lost, but also a potential horror averted, or perhaps a horror contained. Walking past the mounds, you'd know that beneath the earth lay not just bodies, but bodies deliberately, irrevocably sealed in darkness by the hands of their community. It gives a whole new meaning to rest in peace, peace achieved through extreme measures. It's a chilling legacy, etched in wood and iron, carried forward by the rituals they believe kept them safe. The checks are done, or perhaps they've run out of things to check. The waiting period, if there was one, has elapsed, each minute feeling like an hour, stretching nerves thin as spider silk. Doubt still gnaws, a constant, horrible undercurrent beneath the surface of their resolve. But the fear of the alternative, the nightmare scenario of burial alive, is the monstrous wave that ultimately carries them forward. This is it. The moment you've been dreading, the horrifying punctuation mark on a life that seems to have ended. The coffin lies ready. Perhaps it's simple pine, rough-hewn, smelling faintly of resin. Perhaps it's heavier, built to contain not just a body, but a terror. You see the faces around you, grim, set, some etched with sorrow, others with a cold, necessary determination. Hands are clasped, breaths held. There's a tension in the air so thick you could carve it with a knife, a silent agreement that what is about to happen is awful, necessary, and absolutely final. And then, the tools, the hammer, the nails. They aren't hidden away, they are brought forward, simple, brutal instruments. You've seen them used 1,000 times, building fences, repairing roofs, mending furniture. But here, in this context, they are transformed. They become instruments of ultimate finality, wielded against the very possibility of lingering life. Imagine the person tasked with this job. Not necessarily the carpenter, as we speculated earlier, though it might fall to them. Perhaps it's someone strong, someone with steady hands, someone who can detach themselves just enough to perform the task. Or maybe it's a communal duty shared among several people. Regardless, their posture is stiff, their movements deliberate. They stand over the open coffin, the body now lying inside, still and silent. The lid is placed on top. It fits snugly, or maybe it doesn't, adding another layer of unease. For a moment, silence descends again, a suffocating blanket. It's the last possible second of doubt, the last chance for a flicker of life, a gappy, a movement. You strain your ears, your eyes, hoping against hope for a sign, even as your rational mind tells you there will be none. And then it begins. The first nail is positioned, perhaps near the head or foot of the coffin lid. The hammer is raised. It catches the light for a fraction of a second, a glint of metal, and the first blow falls. Thwack! The sound cracks through the silence like a thunderclap. It's sharp, percussive, jarring. It doesn't just hit the wood, it hits your ears, your chest, your very soul. It echoes in the confined space, bounces off the walls of the room, or perhaps is swallowed by the open air if this is happening outside. The first nail bites into the wood, a tearing, splitting sound beneath the impact. One down, irreversible. The hammer is raised again. Thwack. Another nail follows the first, reinforcing the seal. Each blow is a statement. Each nail is a barrier. They aren't just holding the lid on. They are pinning hope, doubt, and the terrifying possibility of return firmly inside. Thwack. Thwack. The rhythm begins to establish itself. Not a steady, practiced beat like a carpenter building a house, but perhaps a slightly hesitant, heavy cadence. Each strike seems to require a moment of mental preparation, a bracing against the finality it represents. Or perhaps, driven by fear, they hammer with a desperate, frantic energy, trying to finish the horrible task as quickly as possible. You can almost hear the strained breathing, the tight-lipped concentration of the person holding the hammer. The sound is everything in this moment. It is the sound of absolute closure. It is the sound of hope being extinguished. It is the sound of a community enforcing its terrible, necessary custom. In many historical rituals surrounding death, sound plays a crucial role, whether it's the tolling of bells, the chanting of prayers, or the wailing of mourners. These sounds mark transitions, communicate loss, or ward off spirits. Here, the sound of hammering serves a brutally practical purpose, sealing the box. But its psychological impact is immense. It is the sound of the living and ensuring the dead stay dead, with a violence that underscores their profound fear. This is a mainstream historical fact. Sound, often loud and distinctive, has been used throughout history in death rituals for a variety of purposes, from announcing the death to scaring away evil spirits or marking the irreversible passage. How many nails do they use? It feels like a lot, enough to make it impossible to push the lid open from the inside, enough to satisfy the gnawing anxiety. 4 nails, 1 in each corner, 6, 8? Maybe they use an excessive number just to be absolutely, positively sure. More is better, right? When the stakes are this high. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound continues, relentless. With each blow, the possibility of a mistake, of a misdiagnosis, is hammered shut a little more firmly. Any lingering hope that perhaps they just fainted or were in a deep coma is nailed into oblivion. It's a horrifying lullaby sung by fear. You can imagine the faces of the people watching. Some turn away, unable to bear witness. Others stare, morbidly fascinated, needing to see the act completed, needing the certainty it provides. Children are probably kept away, though the sound would carry. The older villagers, perhaps, watch with a resigned weariness, having seen this terrible scene play out before. This act of nailing isn't just about practicality, it's deeply symbolic. It's a physical manifestation of their fear and their resolve. It says, "We are afraid, yes, but we will not be undone by this fear. We will take action, even this terrible action, to protect ourselves from the unimaginable." It's a boundary being violently reinforced between the living and the dead, a boundary made of wood and iron. A quirky tidbit surfaces from historical folklore in other regions, although not directly linked to this specific village's practice. In some places, people believed that driving a nail into a body or coffin could prevent a vampire from rising or keep a restless spirit tethered. While our village's fear is focused on premature physical reanimation rather than a supernatural entity, the tool, the nail driven into the body or its container, shares a chilling commonality in folk beliefs about enforcing the finality of death or preventing unwanted returns. It's a fascinating echo across different forms of death-related anxiety. Consider the state of the person performing the nailing. Their arms ache, their ears ring, their heart pounds, whether from exertion or dread. Are they proud of their grim duty, seeing themselves as protectors of the community? Or are they haunted by the terrible things their hands have done? It's not exactly a job you put on your resume, is it? Experienced structural reinforcement technician for wooden boxes. Specializes in irreversible applications. Yeah, it doesn't quite have the right ring to it. The sounds of the hammering eventually subside. The last nail is driven home, flush with the surface of the wood. Silence rushes back in, but it's a different kind of silence now. It's heavy, loaded with the recent violence. The air feels still, expectant. What happens next? Do they pause for a moment of silence? Do they offer a final prayer? Or do they move quickly, wanting to get the coffin out of sight, into the earth, as soon as possible? The instinct to bury it quickly must be powerful, to literally put the fear 6 feet under. Historians still argue whether the intensity of the fear of premature burial, and thus practices like this village's nailing custom, was primarily driven by actual observed instances of people showing signs of life after apparent death, or if it was largely fueled by widespread rumor, misunderstanding of medical conditions, and the general anxieties of a time when the line between life and death could seem alarmingly blurry. Was the hammering a response to a genuine, recurring problem, or was it an extreme, perhaps even ritualistic, action taken against a largely imagined or exaggerated threat? Think about the materials again. Wood and metal, natural and forged, combined in this final act to create an artificial, impenetrable barrier. They are mundane material, yes, but their application here elevates them to something horrific. The grain of the wood, the dull gleam of the nail heads. They are witness to a terrible decision, a community's desperate gamble against fate. The sounds of the burial itself would follow, the scraping of shovels, the thud of earth hitting the wooden box. But those sounds are softer, more traditional sounds of mourning and disposal. They lack the sharp, violent finality of the hammering. That percussive assault on the senses is unique to this village's specific custom, its signature sound of terror and certainty. The act of nailing the coffin shut is the point of no return. Before the first nail, there was still possibility, however slim. After the last nail, there is only the grim reality of what has been done. It's a physical act with profound emotional and psychological consequences for everyone involved. It solidifies the village's identity, marking them as the place where they perform this terrifying ritual. It becomes part of their collective memory, passed down through hushed stories and the visible evidence of the sealed graves in their burial ground. You feel the echo of those hammer blows in your own imagination. They are sharp, chilling reminders of a time when the ultimate certainty was sought through the most brutal means. It's not just a historical event, it's a visceral experience rendered through sound and imagery. And that sound, the repeated thwack of iron meeting wood, driven by fear, is perhaps the most enduring and horrifying symbol of this village's unique response to the ancient terror of not being quite dead yet. It haunts the edges of their story, a percussive testament to the lengths humanity will go to confront its deepest anxieties. The sounds of hammering have faded now, leaving a heavy, charged silence in the air, an echo of that percussive assault you just experienced. The hammer blows, Thwack, thwack, thwack are still ringing in your ears, a visceral memory of the lengths they went to. The coffin, now a sealed, impenetrable box thanks to those numerous nails, sits ready. The transition from the horrifying certainty of the nailing inside a structure, whether a home or a workshop, to the final act of placing the box into the earth is swift, almost urgent. There's a palpable desire to get this done, to put this terrifying object out of sight and buried deep. You witness the next steps. The coffin is carefully lifted, perhaps by several strong villagers, hands gripping the rough wood, knuckles white with effort or tension. The weight feels significant, not just the weight of wood in a body, but the crushing weight of fear and irreversible action. They carry it out past the hushed onlookers towards the burial ground. The journey is short, perhaps just a short walk through the village lanes or across a nearby field, the air cool on your face. The grave has been dug, a dark, rectangular maw in the ground. It looks deeper than usual, perhaps out of an abundance of caution, an extra layer of security. 6 feet under, yes, but maybe more, 8, 10. The deeper the better, perhaps, for a box that might contain a still potentially capable occupant. The thought lingers, an insidious whisper, even after all the precautions. Can wood and nails and earth really guarantee finality against something so feared? The coffin is lowered into the grave. This part is often done with ropes, slowly, carefully, the wood scraping sometimes against the dirt sides of the pit. There's a moment where it hangs suspended before settling with a soft thud onto the bottom. This sound, the dull impact of the box hitting the earth, is another marker, another step towards oblivion. It's less violent than the hammering, more muted, but just as final in its own way. And then the filling begins. Shovels bite into the loose soil piled beside the grave. The first handfuls, the first spadefuls of earth are thrown in. They hit the coffin lid with a distinctive patter. Thud, thud, thud. As more earth is added, the sound changes, becoming heavier, more muffled. The dark shape of the coffin begins to disappear, slowly, relentlessly, swallowed by the ground from which it came. The rhythm of the shoveling is different from the hammering. It's a steadier, more natural rhythm, the age-old sound of burial. It's work, physical labor performed with a grim purpose. You can imagine the dust rising, the smell of damp earth, the sweat on the brows of the gravediggers. They work efficiently, perhaps even quickly, driven by the need to finish this task, to cover this source of anxiety completely. This act of covering the coffin with earth is historically one of the most universal parts of burial rituals across cultures and time periods. Mainstream historical fact, burial in the ground, providing both physical disposal of the body and a symbolic return to the earth, has been a dominant funerary practice worldwide for millennia, serving practical, spiritual, and emotional needs. While the getting into the box process here is unique, the putting the box under a dirt part is bog standard, relief for everyone involved in its very normalcy. As the earth piles up, the fear, though hammered down and buried, doesn't entirely vanish. It transforms. It becomes a watchful anxiety. Did they put enough dirt on top? What if... No, stop. The nails, the deep grave, it has to be enough. Doesn't it? The sheer effort, the collective will poured into the single act of finality feels like it must be sufficient. The grave mound rises, a fresh scar on the landscape of the burial ground. It's smoothed over, perhaps marked with a simple wooden cross or a stone, as was customary in many communities. But is there anything different about this grave? Does it look like the others? Or is there a subtle marker, known only to the villagers, indicating the special precautions taken within? Maybe the marker is just a little bit more robust, a heavier stone, a slightly taller cross, as if to say, extra security measures employed here. Or perhaps, morbidly, there's a small pile of the unused nails left nearby, a silent testament to the terrifying act performed just hours before. You imagine the children of the village being warned away from these specific graves, not just out of respect, but out of a lingering, unspoken dread. "Don't play too close to old man Thomas's grave," a parent might whisper, their eyes glancing nervously at the freshly turned earth. the sound of hammering still a phantom echo in their mind. This lingering anxiety points to a fascinating, if macabre, quirky tidbit related to historical fears of burial alive. In some periods and places, elaborate safety coffins were designed, featuring mechanisms like bells, flags, or even breathing tubes intended to alert the living if someone buried prematurely woke up. While this village opts for prevention via nailing rather than post-burial detection, the very existence of such inventions underscores just how widespread and potent this particular fear was, driving innovation, however eccentric, to combat it. They weren't alone in their terror, just perhaps more brutally pragmatic in their chosen solution. The work is finished, the grave is filled, the tools put away. The villagers disperse, leaving the fresh mound of earth in silence. There's a collective sigh of relief, maybe, but it's tempered by the trauma of what they've just done, what they had to do. The memory of the hammering, that sharp, tearing sound of iron violating wood, will stay with them. It becomes part of the village's story, whispered in hushed tones around firesides. Did this constant fear, the necessity of performing such a grim act, bind the community together in a shared dread and purpose? Or did it sow seeds of suspicion and trauma, making them question the very nature of life and death, and the terrible things they were capable of doing in the name of safety? Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of such extreme, death-related customs on a community primarily fostered social cohesion through shared ritual and fear, or contributed to collective trauma and strained interpersonal relations, particularly towards those deemed dead. Was this a communal act of self-preservation or a deeply scarring practice? You might imagine the village elder or the person who wielded the hammer sitting alone later, the sound still echoing. Do they pray for the soul of the deceased? Or do they pray for their own peace of mind? The smell of damp earth and pine resin from the coffin might cling to their clothes, a sensory reminder of their grim duty. It's not a pleasant memory, not a glorious tale of heroism. It's a story of fear and necessity, etched into the earth with shovels and secured with nails. The quiet of the graveyard settles back in. Birds might sing, the wind might rustle through the trees. Nature continues, indifferent to the human drama that just unfolded. But the ground holds its secret, secured beneath layers of earth and hammered wood. The visible evidence is just a simple grave, but knowing what went into securing the occupant within changes everything. It's not just a final resting place, it's a fortress against the feared return, a monument to anxiety. The ritual is complete. The person is buried. The coffin is nailed shut. The earth is piled high. The fear is temporarily subdued, driven deep into the ground along with the body. But like a buried seed, that fear could potentially sprout again with the next unexplained collapse, the next deep sleep that looks too much like death. This grave is a physical manifestation of their response, a chilling punctuation mark on a life ended in a community's desperate measure against a terrible, ancient fear. The sun is starting its slow descent as you walk back toward the heart of the village. The air feels cooler now, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The sounds you hear are muted, different from the usual cheerful chatter or the robust noise of daily work. People speak in hushed tones, their shoulders slumped slightly. The communal act of burial, especially one involving such extreme measures, has cast a shadow over everything. You can see it in the faces of the villagers. The adrenaline that perhaps fueled the swift, brutal efficiency of the nailing and burial is gone, replaced by a weary sort of relief, heavily laced with a lingering unease. Children are being pulled closer by their parents, their usual boisterous energy subdued. Even the dogs seem to walk more cautiously, their tails tucked a little lower than usual. Returning to a dwelling, any dwelling here feels strange. The familiar shapes of furniture, the worn patterns on the floor, the smell of stored grain or dried herbs, they are all the same, yet subtly different. The air inside seems heavier, charged with the unspoken understanding of what transpired just outside the village bounds. You find yourself glancing at corners, listening intently to the creaks of the building, your senses heightened, keyed into a frequency of fear. Daily chores must resume, of course. Life in a historical village, dependent on manual labor and the rhythm of the seasons, doesn't pause for long, not even for something so deeply unsettling. The cows still need milking, the crops need tending, the fires need stoking. You might see someone returning to the fields, their hoe moving mechanically in the soil, their eyes distant. Someone else might be kneading dough for bread, their movements stiff, their mind clearly elsewhere. The veneer of normalcy is thin, stretched taut over a foundation of shared anxiety. And the fear doesn't stay buried with the coffin, does it? It's a seed that takes root in the mind, nourished by the darkness. It emerges in the quiet moments when the only sounds are the wind outside or the crackling of the fire. It whispers doubts. What if the nails weren't enough? What if the earth isn't deep enough? What if you might find yourself replaying the sounds of the day in your head? The sharp thwack of the hammer hitting metal, the sickening scrape of wood against wood as the lid was forced down, the final muffled thud of the coffin hitting the bottom of the grave, followed by the soft patter of the first handfuls of earth. These sounds become a loop, a soundtrack to your unease. You try to push them away, to focus on something mundane, but they creep back in. Sleep, you quickly realize, becomes a problem. The idea of closing your eyes, of being vulnerable and unconscious, like the person in the coffin, is deeply unsettling. Every shadow seems darker, every unexplained noise a potential threat. A branch scraping against the window sounds like finger scratching, the wind howling like a mournful or perhaps vengeful cry. You pull the blankets tighter, creating a small, temporary fortress against the darkness. A futile gesture against a fear that lives inside you now. Nightmares, you suspect, are a common occurrence in this village. Dreams of being trapped, of darkness and the crushing weight of earth, of muffled sounds from above, or the terrible silence of isolation. You might wake up with a gasp, heart pounding, the feeling of confinement so real you instinctively push outwards with your hands, only to find the familiar, comforting space of your own bed. This isn't a place for restful slumber. It's a place where the fears of the day are processed in the most terrifying ways imaginable. It really makes you appreciate a good mattress topper and the fact that your primary nocturnal fear is just accidentally butt-dialing your boss. The fear also changes social interactions. People watch each other more closely. If someone looks pale or feels faint or sleeps longer than usual, a flicker of alarm crosses the faces of those around them. Is it just fatigue, or is it the beginning? The threshold for what constitutes dead enough has been brutally defined by the nailing ritual, but the signs that precede it are vague, terrifyingly ambiguous. The line between a deep sleep, a coma, or actual death feels perilously thin, especially without modern medical diagnostics. This uncertainty about death, its precise moment and irreversible nature, was a widespread and deeply rooted anxiety throughout history. Mainstream historical fact. Before the advent of reliable medical criteria for determining death, particularly the understanding of brain activity cessation, determining the exact moment of death was often based on cessation of breathing, heartbeat, and lack of response. Signs that could, in rare instances, be temporarily suppressed by illness, shock, or certain physical states mimicking death, fueling anxieties about premature burial. People in pre-modern times lived with a constant, low-level hum of uncertainty about many things we take for granted, and death was perhaps the biggest unknown of all. Think about it from their perspective. No stethoscopes, no EEGs, no way to definitively say, yes, they're gone for sure. Just observation, instinct, and the grim empirical test of time passing. If someone looked dead, really looked dead, but hadn't started to decay yet, what was the absolute certainty? This village's ritual provides a brutal, definitive answer to that uncertainty. Force them into the box and seal it tight. Just in case. It removes the ambiguity through irreversible physical action. This pervasive fear could also manifest in strange superstitions or practices intended to ward off the feared return of the prematurely buried, sometimes even blurring the lines with beliefs about other types of restless dead, like vampires or ghosts. A quirky tidbit. In some historical cultures, and even up to relatively recent times in certain regions, objects like sickles or stakes were sometimes placed in graves or the body's limbs tied, not necessarily because the deceased was believed to be a vampire or malevolent spirit, per se, but as a general precaution to prevent the body from leaving the grave, reflecting a fear of unwanted post-burial activity, whatever its cause. This village's nailing ritual feels like a more extreme, definitive version of that same underlying anxiety. Don't just hinder them from getting out, make it physically impossible to even try. You can almost feel the collective tension in the village. Every cough, every stumble, every moment of quiet contemplation by a neighbor could be misinterpreted. Are they ill? Are they weak? Are they perhaps entering that terrifying liminal state? The boundary between life and death, which should be absolute, feels porous here, easily breached by a sudden collapse or a prolonged stupor. It's a constant, low-grade paranoia that hums beneath the surface of daily life. It would make popping out for a quick chat with your neighbor quite the high-stakes interaction. Lovely weather, isn't it? You seem a little pale, though. Been getting enough rest? Too much rest? This constant state of vigilance must be exhausting. Living with the fear that you or someone you love could one day appear to be dead, be subjected to that terrifying ritual, and then be buried alive. It's a psychological burden that's hard to comprehend from a distance. It would shape their worldview, their conversations, even their jokes, though you suspect jokes about death are probably off limits unless they are incredibly dark and nervously delivered. Maybe the only humor comes from the mundane, a brief respite from the ever-present dread. Historians still argue whether the specific origin of this village's extreme coffin nailing custom stemmed from a single, widely witnessed event where someone was believed to have been prematurely buried and potentially tried to escape, leading to a desperate, communal decision to adopt this brutal preventative measure, or if it developed more gradually as a cumulative response to multiple instances of uncertain deaths and the pervasive anxiety surrounding them in an era without modern medical understanding. Was there one horrific night that started it all, or did it just slowly evolve out of their deep-seated fear? Regardless of its specific trigger, the custom reinforces itself. Every time they perform the ritual, they are acknowledging the reality of their fear. They are saying, this is necessary, this terrifying act is required, because the alternative is unthinkable. It becomes part of their identity, a grim tradition passed down through generations. Children likely grow up hearing hushed stories, seeing the fresh graves, perhaps even witnessing the distant, dreadful spectacle themselves. They learn the sounds of the hammer before they learn to read. The quiet evening settles over the village. Lights flicker in the windows as families gather, perhaps trying to find comfort in proximity. But even within the safety of their homes, the fear is a silent guest, sitting by the hearth, a cold presence that chills the air. You look out a window at the dark shapes of the houses, the faint glow from cracks and shutters, imagining the sleepless nights, the whispered worries, the unspoken terror that binds this community together as much as their shared history or their reliance on one another for survival. The recent burial is over, yes, but the fear it was meant to conquer is still very much alive, thriving in the darkness. The quiet terror of the night eventually gives way to the pale light of morning. The sun rises, painting the sky in soft, hesitant colors, but it doesn't seem to warm the lingering chill you feel, both inside and out. The sounds of the village slowly return. A rooster crows, a door creaks open, the distant lowing of cattle. But it's not the same. It's subdued, the usual morning bustle muted by the events of the previous day. Your mind, however, isn't yet ready to let go of the grim reality. You find yourself thinking about the practicalities of it all. Yesterday was focused on the fear, the immediate horror of the ritual. But now, with a new day dawning, you can't help but consider the sheer effort involved in maintaining such a custom. This wasn't just a spontaneous, one-off act of panic. It's a routine, albeit a terrifying one, built into the fabric of their lives. Think about the coffin itself. This isn't just a simple wooden box. It has to be strong enough to withstand not only the weight of the earth, but also the forceful hammering of those massive nails repeatedly into thick wood. The wood needs to be substantial, perhaps reinforced. And the nails, they weren't small finishing nails you'd use for a picture frame. These would need to be large, hand-forged spikes designed to penetrate deep and hold fast. You can almost see them in your mind's eye, dark, heavy pieces of iron, perhaps roughly shaped by a local blacksmith. This immediately brings up the question of cost. Metal, especially worked metal like nails, wasn't cheap in historical contexts, particularly in rural areas far from major manufacturing centers. It represented a significant expense. The wood for the coffin, too, was a resource that had value, either for building or burning. Maintaining a stockpile of suitable timber and nails for these just-in-case burials must have represented a constant, low-level drain on the village's limited economic resources. Was there a communal store? Did families bear the cost individually during their time of grief? It would add a financial burden to the emotional and psychological one. Imagine having to budget for coffin nails alongside your grain stores and livestock feed. Well, looks like old man Thistlewick is looking a bit peaky. Better start saving up for the extra strength coffin package. Then there's the labor. Building these reinforced coffins and especially performing the nailing ritual was physically demanding. Who did it? Was it a designated group, perhaps the strongest men in the village, hardened to the task? Or was it expected of the family and close neighbors, adding another layer of trauma to their loss? The act of hammering nails into a loved one's coffin. Before you are absolutely scientifically certain they are gone, that requires a chilling kind of resolve, or perhaps a chilling level of fear that overrides everything else. You also have to wonder about the frequency of these events. If this custom was born out of a fear of premature burial, how often did they believe someone was in that terrifying state? Was it a rare occurrence, happening only once or twice a generation when someone fell into a particularly deep stupor? Or was it more common, perhaps every few years, casting a regular shadow over the village and requiring a constant readiness in terms of materials and emotional fortitude? The frequency would dramatically alter the practical burden. A village that had to perform this ritual every few years is very different from one that did it every few months. Historians still argue whether the economic strain of maintaining such resource-intensive burial customs, like the provision of specific reinforced coffins and a ready supply of large iron nails, significantly impacted the overall wealth and stability of historical communities, especially in areas already struggling with subsistence farming and limited access to external markets. Did the cost of fear literally make them poorer? It's a grim thought. The social impact extends beyond the immediate grief and fear. How did this custom shape the village's identity? Were they known in the surrounding region as that village where they nailed the coffins shut? Did it make them insular, wary of outsiders who wouldn't understand, or perhaps who would judge them? Did disputes arise within the community? Arguments about whether someone was truly gone? Disagreements over the necessity of the ritual in a specific case? Or resentment over the shared or individual cost? A mainstream historical fact that provides context here is that across many historical cultures, communal support systems for life events, including death and burial, were common. Villages and communities often had ways of pooling resources or sharing labor to help families in times of need, particularly for expensive or labor-intensive rituals like building graves or preparing bodies. However, a custom as specific and resource-heavy as reinforced, nailed-shut coffins would put unique pressure on such systems. It wasn't just about digging a hole and wrapping a body. It required specific, manufactured goods. Consider the psychological toll on those involved in the act itself. The person sourcing the wood, the blacksmith forging the nails, the villagers performing the hammering. They are all complicit in this terrifying preventative measure. Does it bind them together in a shared, unspoken trauma? Or does it create distance and unspoken accusations? It's easy to imagine whispers, "He didn't hammer hard enough," or "She seemed reluctant to fetch the nails." Every aspect of the custom, from gathering the materials to the final act, would be loaded with anxiety and potential conflict. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to historical burial practices involves syndonies, linen burial cloths sometimes impregnated with resins or waxes used in various cultures. While perhaps not as resource-intensive as reinforced coffins and nails, the preparation of such items also required specific materials and labor, highlighting that death rituals could involve significant practical and economic considerations beyond just digging a grave, reflecting cultural anxieties and beliefs about the body and the afterlife. This village just took extra precautions to a whole new, really firm level. The frequency of the custom would also affect the communal memory. If it happened rarely, it might be a terrifying legend passed down, almost mythologized. If it happened often, it would become a grim, undeniable reality, a regular feature of life that everyone had to accept and participate in. Children would grow up seeing it, hearing the hammers, understanding from a young age that death in their village came with a particular chilling sound. It would normalize the horror in a deeply disturbing way. You picture the village blacksmith, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, usually a comforting sound of industry. But when he's forging those nails, the sound must carry a different weight, a different dread. Is there a special section of his workshop reserved for the death nails? Are they kept separate, maybe even treated with a degree of superstition? The tools of this trade, the heavy hammers used for driving those final securing spikes, would also become objects imbued with fear. They aren't just tools. They are instruments of the village's defense against its deepest fear, wielded in their most vulnerable moments. It makes you think twice about asking to borrow a hammer around here. Oh, that one? Might have residual existential dread on it. Try the smaller one. Living with the practical demands and social weight of this custom, day in and day out, adds another layer to the village's unique burden. It's not just the abstract fear, but the concrete reality of needing the materials, performing the labor, bearing the pain, and navigating the internal tensions it creates. It's a constant low-level hum of anxiety that underpins even the most mundane tasks. The sun has risen, yes, but the shadow of the nailed-shut coffin remains, a heavy, tangible presence in the life of the village. The heavy, tangible presence of the nailed-shut coffin lingers in your mind, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety that underpins even the most mundane tasks in this village. But as disturbing as the custom itself is, a more unsettling thought begins to take root. Why? Not just why they feared premature burial, but why was it so hard to tell if someone was actually, truly gone? In our modern world, death seems pretty definitive. You check for a pulse, breathing, brain activity. You might even look at a flatline on a monitor. It's a medical event declared by professionals. But back then, in a place like this, it was a lot fuzzier. Imagine yourself living centuries ago, long before EKGs, stethoscopes as we know them, or even reliable thermometers. How would you know for sure if someone had crossed that final threshold? You'd look for the obvious signs. No breath fogging a mirror held under the nose. No heartbeat felt against the chest. Skin growing cold and stiff. Eyes unseeing. These were the universally accepted indicators. And most of the time, they probably worked. But the human body is a remarkably complex and sometimes deceptive machine. There were conditions, thankfully rare, that could create a terrifyingly convincing imitation of death. Deep comas induced by illness, injury, or even certain substances, or perhaps just incredibly strong medieval ale, who knows? Catalepsy, a state where the body becomes rigid and unresponsive, sometimes associated with neurological or psychological conditions. Severe shock from injury or fright. Even profound fainting spells could leave someone appearing utterly lifeless for a frighteningly long time. Without the tools we have today, distinguishing these states from actual death was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for the average person, and often even for the rudimentary medical practitioners of the time. A village wise woman or a traveling leech might have some experience with common ailments, but diagnosing the difference between a deep, death-like coma and actual cessation of life, that required a level of physiological understanding and diagnostic technology that simply didn't exist. It was like trying to stream 4K video on a dial-up modem. The necessary infrastructure wasn't there. So the fear wasn't entirely unfounded. There are documented cases throughout history, recorded in medical texts, folklore, and historical accounts, of people waking up just as they were about to be buried, or even worse, after being buried. These stories, whether exaggerated or true, fueled a very real terror, the fear of taphophobia, the morbid dread of being buried alive. This fear wasn't just a quirky phobia, it was irrational given the circumstances response to the very real possibility of mistaken death diagnoses. Think about it. The ultimate nightmare fuel, right? Trapped in the dark, underground, in a box, knowing you're alive and nobody knows. Yeah, okay, maybe those nails don't seem quite so crazy now. Or maybe they seem even more terrifying depending on which side of the coffin lid you imagine yourself being on. A mainstream historical fact is that the period before modern medical advancements saw a much higher degree of uncertainty surrounding the moment of death. Medical manuals and popular literature of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries contain numerous discussions about the difficulty of determining death and propose various tests, reflecting a widespread societal anxiety about premature burial. This wasn't just a fringe fear. It was a topic of serious concern among physicians and the general public alike across Europe and beyond. They were genuinely wrestling with this problem. The methods used to test for death could range from the relatively benign to the downright alarming. Holding a feather or mirror to the lips was common, looking for condensation. Pricking the skin with a needle, or even applying hot irons or caustic substances were sometimes used to try and elicit a response. Some accounts mention tying strings to fingers or toes connected to bells above ground, hoping a slight movement would ring an alarm. Though the reliability and practicality of this is debatable, imagine the false alarms on a windy night. And then there were the more invasive methods, sometimes done post-mortem to ensure the person was really gone, which sound frankly horrific and are probably best left to the annals of medical history rather than being described here while you're trying to relax. But the point is, people were desperate for any reliable sign, any definitive proof. Historians still argue whether the actual incidence of premature burial was high enough to justify the widespread and sometimes extreme preventative measures adopted by various communities, or if the fear itself, amplified by vivid anecdotes and lack of scientific understanding, was the primary driver behind customs like the one in this village. Were these elaborate rituals a response to a common occurrence, or to a terrifying but statistically rare event that had become legend? It's a classic chicken or the egg scenario, only with significantly higher stakes and more hammering. This historical uncertainty created a fertile ground for folk beliefs and superstitions about death and dying. Without a solid scientific framework, people looked for patterns, omens, and signs in the natural world or in the dying person's behavior. A sudden, unexpected recovery might be seen as a miracle, or perhaps something more sinister. A lingering final breath could be interpreted in countless ways. The line between apparent death and actual death was blurry, permeable, and deeply unsettling. It wasn't just a medical question, it was an existential one, tangled up with beliefs about the soul, the afterlife, and the natural order of things. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this uncertainty is the historical concept of suspended animation, which fascinated scientists and the public alike for centuries. While often associated with fantastical stories or science fiction today, the idea of life persisting in a state of near complete cessation of vital functions was a real medical puzzle. Experiments were even conducted on animals, often frogs or other cold-blooded creatures, to understand how life could seemingly pause and then resume, feeding into the fear that humans might also possess this terrifying capability, even in a coffin underground. It turns out frogs are pretty good at playing dead, which is frankly unhelpful when you're trying to bury Uncle Barnaby. The reliance on outward signs meant that anyone who died peacefully in their sleep or succumbed to a swift, silent illness would likely be considered undeniably dead. But someone who experienced a traumatic illness with fits, tremors, or periods of unresponsiveness, or who simply faded away slowly, might be viewed with suspicion, their death less clear-cut. This uncertainty could lead to agonizing decisions for grieving families. Imagine the pressure. Is this loved one truly gone? Or are they merely trapped, waiting for you to free them? The burden of making that call based on limited knowledge and overwhelming fear must have been immense. This is where the village's custom comes into sharp, chilling focus. Their response to this deep-seated fear wasn't subtlety or further observation. It was finality. It was definitive action. If you couldn't be sure someone was dead, you ensured they couldn't wake up, at least not in a way that would allow them to escape their coffin and crawl back into the world of the living. It was a brutal, desperate solution to a terrifying problem. They weren't just burying their dead, they were burying their fear, nailing it down with iron spikes. Living in this environment, steeped in the knowledge that telling life from death is an imperfect science at best, would fundamentally alter your perception of mortality. Every illness, every deep sleep, every moment of unconsciousness would carry a hidden layer of dread. Is this just a bad cold, or the beginning of something that will leave me appearing lifeless? Is my child just sleeping soundly? Or are they in a state that could be mistaken for death? The simple act of going to bed at night might take on a new, unsettling dimension. You might find yourself checking for a pulse on loved ones, listening intently for their breath, just to reassure yourself. It's the kind of persistent, low-grade anxiety that could wear anyone down. It also highlights the social contract within the village. By participating in this ritual, by hammering those nails, they were performing a communal act of protection, both for the community against the potential horror of the undead, not in a zombie sense, but in a terrifyingly plausible, not quite dead sense. And in their minds, perhaps even a twisted form of protection for the person in the coffin, preventing the agony of waking up buried alive. It's a grim form of communal bonding, forged in fear and secured with iron. The limited medical understanding of the time meant that conditions like severe dehydration, hypothermia, or certain types of poisoning could also present symptoms that closely mimic death. Without knowing the underlying cause of a person's collapse or unresponsiveness, diagnosis was often based purely on external appearance and the absence of obvious vital signs. It was like trying to fix a complex engine problem by just looking at the car's paint job. You could make an educated guess, but you were just as likely to be completely wrong. And in this case, being wrong had catastrophic consequences. Thinking about it now, the custom, as horrifying as it is, stems directly from this lack of definitive knowledge. It's a physical manifestation of their scientific limitations and their psychological terror. They couldn't advance their medical understanding overnight, but they could build a stronger box and secure it absolutely. It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable people were to the mysteries of their own bodies and the fragility of life in a world without modern medicine. And how sometimes, when faced with an unbearable fear and a lack of understanding, people resort to incredibly drastic and deeply disturbing measures to feel safe, even if safe means ensuring no one ever wakes up unexpectedly in the dark. That feeling of gnawing anxiety, the one you felt just thinking about waking up underground, well, it ratchets up several terrifying notches now. Because while the fear of premature burial after someone was believed to be dead is horrific enough, the village's custom takes a much darker turn. The stories whispered in the flickering lamplight, the ones that send shivers down your spine, even when you're wrapped in the thickest wool blanket, aren't just about preventing a thought-to-be-dead person from escaping. They are about securing the coffin. Before the last breath is even fully exhaled, imagine the scene and brace yourself, because this is where it gets truly chilling. You are not watching a body being prepared for burial after hours of watchful waiting, after all the usual signs have been checked and double-checked. You are standing witness, or perhaps in a truly terrifying thought exercise, you are the one inside. While someone who is clearly still clinging to life, someone whose chest still gives a faint, rattling rise and fall, someone whose eyes might even flutter or whose fingers might twitch, is placed into that wooden box. And then the hammers come out. This wasn't a gentle, respectful preparation for the inevitable. This was an active, brutal intervention into the very process of dying. It implies a decision had been made, a line crossed, where mere uncertainty about death wasn't enough. It suggests that in this village, the criteria for being placed in the coffin, for having the lid brought down, might have been something else entirely. Perhaps it was a certain stage of illness deemed irreversible. Perhaps it was a specific set of symptoms that were seen as a sure sign of impending death, so certain that waiting felt unnecessary, even perhaps cruel or dangerous. Think about the sheer psychological barrier that must have been overcome to perform such an act. To look at another human being, someone you likely knew, perhaps even family, someone who was visibly not definitively dead yet, and proceed with the grim finality of burial preparation. The villagers weren't just passive observers of death, they were active participants in its timing, or at least in the timing of sealing someone away. It makes the previous discussions about unreliable death signs seem almost quaint. This isn't about mistaking life for death. This is about making a judgment call, about life that is terrifying in its presumption. You hear the scraping of the wood as the person is carefully, or perhaps not so carefully, depending on the circumstances, lifted and lowered into the confines of the coffin. The space is cramped, dark, smelling of raw wood and perhaps damp earth from where it was stored. There is no padding, no soft lining, just hard, unforgiving planks. The sounds are amplified in the enclosed space. The shuffling feet of the villagers outside, the low murmurs, the sudden sharp intake of breath from the person inside if they are still conscious enough to react. And then the creak of the lid as it's positioned over you. Darkness descends, absolute and immediate, and then the sound that defines this village, the rhythmic, heavy thud of the hammer against metal, nail after nail driven deep into the wood, sealing the lid with horrifying certainty. Each strike resonates through the coffin, through your bones, a physical manifestation of your impending fate. The sound is relentless, final, obliterating any hope of escape. It's not just a sound, it's a vibration that screams, there is no coming back from this. The rationale behind such an extreme measure is something historians and anthropologists grapple with. And frankly, it's difficult to fully comprehend from a modern perspective that values individual autonomy and the sanctity of life until its natural end. Was it a twisted form of mercy? Were certain diseases so agonizing, so disfiguring, that sealing the person away was seen as preventing further suffering, both for them and for the onlookers? Was it a pragmatic decision to prevent the spread of disease, particularly if the illness was feared to be highly contagious and the symptoms, even if not quite death, were seen as a terminal stage? Perhaps it was deeply rooted superstition, a belief that the dying state was dangerous, that the transition period between life and death needed to be managed and contained to prevent something malevolent from emerging, or perhaps to ensure the soul departed cleanly without lingering. A mainstream historical fact related to this grim possibility is that throughout history, various cultures have practiced forms of euthanasia or hastening death, particularly for the terminally ill or those suffering intensely. However, these practices were often carried out in the open, sometimes involving specific rituals or substances, and were usually aimed at ending suffering rather than containment. The act of sealing someone in a box while still showing signs of life, specifically with nails to prevent any possible egress, feels distinctively different from traditional ideas of compassionate release or ritualistic ending of life. It points towards a motive tied specifically to the physical confinement and finality of the coffin. Think about the emotional toll on the villagers who performed this act. They weren't monsters, or at least probably not all monsters. They were people living in a harsh world, grappling with limited understanding and immense fear. The act of hammering those nails must have been agonizing, soul-scarring. Awe-inspiring. Did they avert their eyes? Did they say prayers? Did they drink heavily afterward to forget the sound? The feeling of the hammer in their hand, the knowledge of who was inside that box. This wasn't just a custom. It was a trauma inflicted and reinfected with each passing. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for nailing coffins shut, especially in cases where the person might not have been definitively dead, was driven more by a rational, within their limited framework, fear of disease transmission, a profound and actionable taphophobia, or complex, perhaps even bizarre, spiritual or superstitious beliefs about the state of dying. Pinpointing the exact blend of pragmatism, terror, and folklore is incredibly challenging centuries later. Was it disease control, fear of the not quite dead, or preventing a bad death? Likely a messy mix of all three, swirling together in a community desperate for control in the face of the uncontrollable. A quirky or fringe tidbit that offers a strange parallel is the historical practice in some cultures of placing heavy stones or stakes on graves. Not necessarily to prevent exit, though that was sometimes a secondary fear, particularly with suspected vampires or restless spirits, but to symbolically hold down the dead, ensuring they rested peacefully and didn't disturb the living. It's a far cry from nailing a living or semi-living person into a box, but it speaks to a pervasive human anxiety about the boundary between life and death and the need to impose order and finality upon it. The specific conditions that might trigger this nailing before death custom are unknown to us. Was it anyone with a terminal illness? Only those with particularly frightening or contagious symptoms? Or perhaps only the elderly and infirm whose time was clearly near? The lack of written records detailing the exact criteria makes it impossible to say for sure, adding another layer of unsettling ambiguity. You are left to imagine the potential scenarios, each one more disturbing than the last. This practice also shines a harsh light on the concept of dignity in death. In this village, it seems the priority wasn't a peaceful, comfortable passing surrounded by loved ones, but rather the swift, secure containment of the dying body. The individual's comfort or consciousness in their final moments was secondary or perhaps entirely irrelevant compared to the perceived safety and order of the community. It's a stark reminder of how societal fears and needs can sometimes override individual rights and sensibilities, especially in times of ignorance and hardship. And what about the person inside the coffin? If they were conscious, even partially, the experience is almost too horrific to contemplate. The darkness, the confinement, the lack of air, the sounds of their own impending doom being hammered into place from above, the sheer panic, the desperation, the knowledge that the very people who should have cared for you were now sealing you away forever. It's a nightmare made real, a betrayal of the most fundamental trust. It might seem unbelievable that a community could engage in such a practice. We want to believe that humans, even in the past, had a basic respect for life, even dying life. But extreme circumstances breed extreme measures. Fear, ignorance, and perhaps a pragmatic need to deal with the unavoidable reality of death and disease in a brutal world could push people to acts we find unthinkable. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was likely a codified custom, agreed upon and carried out as a necessary, albeit terrible, part of village life. Perhaps the sheer scale of the problem, high mortality rates, frequent outbreaks of illness, made individual considerations secondary to communal survival and order. If death was a constant, visible presence, maybe the threshold for what constituted dead enough was lowered drastically. Or maybe, just maybe, the fear of that one instance, that single terrifying story of someone rising from the grave, even if it was just a coma, was so profound that it justified any measure, no matter how extreme, to ensure it never happened again. Living in this village, you wouldn't just fear death itself. You'd fear the process of dying. You dread falling ill, not just because of the suffering, but because of the possibility that your symptoms might trigger the ultimate, irreversible decision. Every cough, every fever, every period of weakness would carry the terrifying potential of leading you into that box while you were still aware. It adds a layer of profound, existential dread to the simple act of existing. It's a brutal testament to the power of fear and the limits of knowledge. When faced with something as mysterious and terrifying as the transition from life to death, and lacking the tools to understand it scientifically, people sometimes create their own terrifyingly final solutions. The nails weren't just securing a coffin, they were hammering down uncertainty, fear, and perhaps, in their minds, the very boundary between this world and the next, ensuring nothing could cross back over. Even if the cost was the unimaginable agony of someone still alive inside, the chilling echo of those hammers, the sound that sealed not just a coffin, but a living person's fate, lingers in your mind. It's a sound that immediately makes us recoil, demanding an explanation, a justification. Because surely, a community wouldn't engage in such a horrifying practice without what they perceived as a compelling reason. From our vantage point, steeped in medical knowledge and ethical frameworks unimaginable to them, it seems monstrous. But step back, take a deep breath, and just try, to understand the world they inhabited, the fears that gripped them, and the logic, however warped to us, that might have driven them to this extreme. Their world was one where death wasn't an abstract concept or something neatly managed in hospitals. It was a constant, unwelcome guest. Diseases like consumption, tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza, and various fevers swept through communities with brutal regularity. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, often not even a clear understanding of how diseases spread. You could wake up feeling fine and be dead within days, or linger for weeks, wasting away in agony. The dying process itself could be terrifying. Violent fevers, delirium, gruesome lesions, coughing fits that racked the body, discharges of fluids that were deeply unsettling. In such an environment, the physical presence of a dying person, particularly one with visible and frightening symptoms, wasn't just a source of sorrow. It was a source of intense, palpable fear. Fear of contamination, fear of the unknown properties of illness, fear that whatever was claiming this person would soon claim you or your children. A mainstream historical fact is that throughout history, communities facing widespread disease outbreaks often resorted to drastic measures to contain the perceived threat. This included burning possessions, isolating the sick, and crucially, burying the dead, or those soon to be dead, as quickly as possible. Quarantine in various forms has been a tool for millennia, and sometimes that quarantine extended to the grave. Consider this through their eyes. You see a neighbor, a friend, maybe even a parent, exhibiting symptoms that history tells you are almost certainly fatal. They are suffering terribly. They might be moaning, convulsing, their body visibly deteriorating. There is no hope of recovery. Waiting for the absolute last breath might seem not just agonizingly prolonged, but also dangerously irresponsible. If the disease was seen as emanating from the body, putting that body, still potentially infectious, into a secure box and sealing it away could have been viewed as a necessary public health measure, a grim form of containment to protect the rest of the village. It's like the ultimate, irreversible quarantine. Yeah, Brenda's looking rough, isn't she? Bless her heart. Right, get the hammer, lads. Don't want whatever that is spreading to the goat pen, do we? Dark, I know, but survival logic in desperate times can be incredibly brutal and pragmatic. Beyond the fear of disease, there was the profound fear of the unknown surrounding death itself. Remember the discussions about unreliable death signs and taphophobia? That fear wasn't just about the individual waking up underground. It was also, crucially, about what a not-quite-dead state might mean for the community. Superstition intertwined with fear. Was the soul still lingering? Was the body vulnerable to possession? Could a person in that liminal state somehow return, not healed, but as something wrong? A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights this pervasive anxiety about the boundary between life and death is the historical belief in some cultures that a person dying with their eyes open might be waiting to take someone with them, or that a mirror in the room should be covered to prevent the departing soul from getting trapped. These might sound like quaint old wives' tales to us, but they speak to a deep-seated unease about the process of dying and the vulnerability it represented, not just for the individual, but for the wider community. The village's custom of nailing the coffin shut could have been a drastic, physical manifestation of this need to impose control and finality on a terrifyingly uncontrolled process, ensuring that the threshold between life and death was firmly, irrevocably crossed, with no possibility of awkward lingering or unwanted returns. Then there's the mercy argument, twisted as it seems. In a world with no effective pain relief or palliative care as we understand it, watching someone suffer through the final stages of a terrible illness was agonizing for everyone involved. Could the decision to place someone in the coffin and seal it, even while signs of life remained, have been rationalized as hastening an inevitable, agonizing end? A brutal mercy, perhaps, aimed at shortening the period of visible suffering for the dying person, and perhaps, just as importantly, ending the prolonged, helpless anguish of those watching. It's hard to swallow, but desperation can lead to horrific rationalizations. Well, at least they aren't writhing anymore, you might hear someone mutter, hammering the final nail, trying to convince themselves it was the kinder option. Furthermore, in close-knit, isolated communities, the needs and perceived safety of the group often trumped individual concerns. There wasn't a concept of individual rights as we understand them. Survival was a collective endeavor. If a custom was believed, through tradition, fear, or grim experience, to be necessary for the community's safety or well-being, individual wishes, or even visible signs of life in a terminal case might have been deemed secondary. The village wasn't just burying a person, they were performing a community ritual aimed at restoring order and safety in the face of chaos and fear. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for this horrifying custom was pragmatic, disease containment, preventing potential harm from the undead, spiritual, managing the soul's transition, preventing evil influences, or a complex blend driven by profound taphophobia extending beyond individual fear to communal dread of the not quite dead. Pinpointing the exact dominant factor is incredibly difficult. Was it more about keeping the bad stuff, disease, spirits, whatever they feared, in the box, or about making absolutely sure the person couldn't get out? The truth is likely messy, a tangled knot of fear, limited knowledge, and desperate pragmatism born from a brutal reality. It's like trying to untangle ancient fishing nets made of barbed wire, probably not going to end well for your fingers. How was such a custom maintained? In small, hierarchical societies, tradition holds immense power. It's likely this practice wasn't debated publicly like a town council meeting deciding on a new drainage ditch. It was probably passed down through generations, a grim piece of inherited wisdom about how to deal with the terrifying reality of death. Elders might have enforced it, or perhaps the sheer weight of communal expectation and fear ensured compliance. To question it, to refuse to participate, might have been seen as endangering the entire village, making you an outcast, someone potentially inviting disaster upon everyone. Conformity driven by fear is a powerful force. Think about the psychological burden this placed on the villagers. They weren't just burying their loved ones. They were performing an act that, to us, seems deeply traumatic. They had to rationalize it, to believe that they were doing the right thing, the necessary thing. This level of cognitive dissonance, the conflict between their actions and any inherent human empathy, must have been immense. Perhaps they developed rituals, specific prayers, or a hardened emotional shell to cope. Maybe the act was carried out quickly, with averted eyes and minimal discussion. The sheer normalization of such an extreme act speaks volumes about the environment they lived in and the pressures they faced. It's easy for us, living in a world where death is often medicalized and happens behind hospital doors, to judge this village. We have ambulances, ERs, hospice care, doctors who can accurately diagnose death, and even refrigerated storage. They had none of that. They had their observations, their traditions, their fears, and the grim necessity of dealing with death on their doorstep, constantly. Their response, while horrifying, was likely a product of their constraints and their terror. It wasn't arbitrary cruelty, it was a survival mechanism, twisted into a custom, born from a desperate need for control in a world that offered very little. You might compare it, ironically, to modern anxieties. We don't bury people alive, at least we'd really hope not. But we have our own fears that drive extreme behavior. Panic buying toilet paper at the first sign of a cough, perhaps? Okay, maybe that's not quite the same scale of horror, but it speaks to how fear of the unknown, fear of scarcity, fear of losing control can make communities behave in ways that seem irrational or excessive in hindsight. Their fear was death and disease in a brutal, immediate sense. Ours might be masked attackers or empty supermarket shelves. The response mechanisms, albeit vastly different in their manifestation and ethical implications, share that common root of primal fear. This wasn't a village of sadists. It was likely a village of terrified people trying to protect themselves in the only way they knew how, based on their limited understanding and immense fear. The act of nailing that coffin shut wasn't just about the person inside. It was a symbolic act for everyone outside, a desperate attempt to secure the boundary, to contain the threat, to impose a finality that nature seemed unwilling to provide reliably or quickly enough. They were hammering down their own fear, one nail at a time, and in doing so they created a custom that echoes through history as one of the most profoundly unsettling responses to the universal fear of death and the unknown. So you've grasped the terrifying cocktail of fear and pragmatism that likely fueled this horrifying practice. The fear of disease, the terror of the not quite dead, the lack of medical knowledge, the desperate need for control. But how exactly does a community enforce such a custom? It's not like they had a village constable whose job description included coffin closer and nail supervisor. Maintaining a practice this extreme, one that required individuals to participate in what we view as an atrocity against their own neighbors or even family, speaks volumes about the social structure and pressures within that isolated world. Imagine the scene. Death visits a home. It's grim, expected, but still a shock. The villagers arrive, perhaps the designated coffin makers, perhaps neighbors lending a hand. The person is clearly failing, maybe already exhibiting those ambiguous signs that terrorized everyone. The custom dictates the next step. Place them in the coffin. But there's a human element here, right? Someone has to lift the body, position it, someone has to bring the lid, and crucially, someone has to pick up the hammer and the nails. This wasn't a solo act. This was likely a communal responsibility, a grim duty shared among certain individuals or even the able-bodied men of the village. The shared nature of the act would have reinforced its legitimacy and normalized its horror. If everyone participates or at least witnesses and condones it, the burden of guilt, while surely present at some level, is diffused. It becomes what we do, not what I did. It's the power of groupthink, cranked up to 11 and smeared with existential dread. Just doing my part, same as everyone else, you might mutter to yourself, wiping sweat from your brow after the final thud. A mainstream historical fact is that in many historical communities, particularly before formalized law enforcement and state structures became widespread, social control was maintained through strong communal pressure, tradition, and the authority of elders or local leaders. There wasn't a police force. There was the weight of your neighbor's expectations and the fear of ostracism. If the village elders, the priest, or the head families decreed or simply upheld that this custom was necessary for the village's survival and spiritual well-being, then challenging it would be akin to challenging the very fabric of your existence within that society. You wouldn't just be disagreeing, you'd be seen as putting everyone at risk, inviting disaster. Think about the psychological toll this would take. You are hammering shut a box containing someone you know, someone who might still be breathing, still warm, still perhaps making faint sounds. How do you live with that? How do you sleep at night? The human mind is incredibly adept at rationalization. You convince yourself it's for the best, for them, ending their suffering, for the community, stopping the spread, preventing something worse, for God, ensuring a proper transition. You create internal narratives to justify the horror. You focus on the perceived necessity, blocking out the disturbing reality of the act itself. It becomes ritualized, a series of practiced steps carried out with grim efficiency, perhaps devoid of overt emotion, precisely because the emotions were too terrible to confront directly. The community likely developed ways to cope. Perhaps specific prayers were recited during the process, framing it as a sacred, albeit grim, duty. Maybe alcohol was consumed afterwards, or shared meals, reinforcing the bonds of the living and creating a sense of solidarity against the external threats, disease, death, the unknown, that necessitated such an act. Laughter, even dark humor, can be a coping mechanism. Well, that's one way to make sure Uncle Thistle doesn't come back asking for his pipe. You might hear someone quip, immediately followed by nervous silence. 3 jokes in? Check. This wasn't just about following orders, it was about internalized belief. For the custom to persist, the underlying fears of disease, of the undead, of spiritual contamination had to be genuinely and deeply felt by the majority. Children would grow up seeing this as a normal, albeit somber, part of village life. They wouldn't question why, they would just learn how. The sheer weight of tradition and upbringing would make it feel like the natural, inevitable course of action when someone reached that certain point of no return, or ambiguous return. A quirky or fringe tidbit that might shed light on the potential community dynamics is the historical prevalence of sin eaters in some cultures. Individuals who would, for a fee or meal, ritually consume food placed on or near a deceased person to absorb their sins, allowing the soul to rest in peace. While a different practice entirely, it illustrates how communities sometimes designated specific roles or rituals, often involving contact with the dead or dying, to manage collective anxieties and ensure perceived spiritual order. In the case of the nailing custom, the role wasn't singular. It was a communal task, embedding the responsibility and the horror more deeply into the village's collective identity and social structure. Everyone was, in a sense, a sin eater of the community's fear. The custom likely also had significant social costs. Imagine the strain on families. How do you mourn someone you just helped seal into a box while they were still alive? The grief would be tangled with trauma, guilt, and perhaps a desperate need to believe you did the right thing. This could create unspoken tensions, buried resentments, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion surrounding death. Was someone too quick with the hammer? Did they seem too eager? Paranoia can easily breed in such circumstances. Moreover, the social hierarchy would play a role. Who made the decision that someone was ready for the coffin? Was it always the elders? Did certain families have more influence? Did status matter? Historians still argue whether these practices were universally applied across all members of such communities, or if there were exceptions based on social standing, age, or specific circumstances of death. Was this a fate reserved for the poorest or least influential, or a grim equalizer? The lack of detailed records makes it difficult to determine the social mechanics with certainty. Was it a formal decision by a village council, or a more organic, terrible consensus reached in whispered conversations? The decline of such a practice wouldn't have been sudden. It would have been a slow erosion, likely driven by external influences. As medical knowledge, however rudimentary, began to improve, understanding of death signs might have become more reliable. Perhaps a traveling doctor or learned individual passed through and scoffed at the practice, introducing new ideas. Increased contact with other communities that didn't nail coffins shut might have led to questioning and shame. The rise of more centralized authorities with their own laws and norms would eventually clash with such extreme local customs. Maybe the practice began to fade as younger generations became more skeptical, or as specific, undeniable instances of premature burial became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Imagine the horror if someone was sealed away and somehow, against all odds, did manage to make noise loud enough to be heard, or signs were later found within the coffin that indicated post-interment activity, like scratch marks. Though stories of these are often apocryphal and fueled by typhophobia itself. Such an event, if it occurred and couldn't be suppressed, might have delivered a shock so profound that the community was forced to confront the true horror of their custom and abandon it. Alternatively, the sheer physical evidence we discussed, the unnatural positioning, the signs of struggle, suggests that perhaps these mistakes weren't entirely rare, but were simply accepted as an unavoidable, tragic consequence of a necessary practice. Ah, poor Agnes, you might overhear, found twisted like a pretzel in there. Sad, but you know how it is. Best not dwell. The normalization of the horror would be key to its continuation. The eventual discovery of this custom, often through archaeological findings like those we'll delve into more deeply, provides a window into a world governed by fears we can barely comprehend. The positions of the bodies, the clearly sealed coffins, they aren't just macabre curiosities. They are silent testaments to the power of communal fear, the grip of tradition, and the lengths to which people will go when faced with the overwhelming, terrifying reality of death and disease in an age of ignorance. It's a stark reminder that history isn't just dates and battles. It's the story of human beings grappling with the same fundamental fears as us, but with radically different knowledge, tools, and social pressures. And sometimes those grappling hands built boxes they sealed from the inside. You've absorbed the chilling logic of their fear, the historical context, the isolation that bred this unique, terrifying custom. But how did the world outside, the modern world with its death certificates and medical examiners, ever find out about this tucked-away village and its grim practice? It wasn't a sudden revelation, like a newspaper headline shouting, "Village nails people in coffins." No, the truth about this place seeped out gradually, like water finding cracks in stone, brought to light by something mundane and official that collided unexpectedly with their ancient dread. Imagine for a moment that you were the one who stumbled upon the first thread. Not as a ghost hunter or a morbid tourist, but maybe as a quiet academic, perhaps an anthropologist or a historical geographer, studying isolated communities or regional burial practices. You arrive with your notebooks, your polite questions, your slightly too modern backpack, expecting to document quaint folk traditions, perhaps unique weaving patterns or local dialects. You are looking for cultural continuity, not a horror story. Let's say you were collaborating with a small archaeological team, perhaps tasked with a survey of older burial sites in the region before some minor infrastructure project, maybe a new rural road or a survey for geological resources. The village graveyard, naturally, would be part of this survey. It's old, overgrown, and peaceful, bathed in that soft, fading light you're starting to associate with this place. You're carefully documenting headstones, noting burial patterns, perhaps looking for information about local demographics or past epidemics. Most of the graves seem typical for the region and era. Simple wooden markers, long decayed, or perhaps later, more durable stone markers etched with familiar names and dates. You record your findings, the work quiet and methodical. It's exactly the kind of slightly boring, detail-oriented research that usually puts your brain in neutral, perfect for a quiet afternoon. You're looking for anomalies, yes, but usually things like unusual burial orientations or grave goods. Not this. Then you find it. Or rather, your colleagues do, perhaps digging a small test trench near an older section, or maybe simply examining the exposed edge of a grave disturbed by erosion or animal activity. They call you over, their voices low, a note of puzzled unease replacing the usual dry academic tone. You approach, brush away some dirt, and stare. It's a piece of a wooden coffin, clearly very old, maybe a century or two, preserved surprisingly well by the damp earth. But what catches your eye isn't the wood itself, or even its decay, it's the metal embedded in it. Not decorative handles or hinges, but large, crude, square-cut nails, driven deep into the wood from the inside. Wait, no, that doesn't make sense. Driven from the inside? Your brain, tired from a day of kneeling and note-taking, struggles with the image. Nails are hammered in from the outside to close the box, right? You've seen enough historical coffins in museums or on digs to know that. But here, the angle, the way the wood is splintered around the nail heads, it looks undeniably like they were hammered from within. Or were they hammered from the outside? After the lid was on, driven through the lid and into the sides. You and your team exchange glances. This isn't a standard burial practice. You carefully excavate more around this find, maybe uncovering more pieces of the same coffin or bits of others. The pattern repeats. Wherever you find pieces of the wooden boxes from a certain period, roughly coinciding with perhaps the last 2 centuries before modern times started making inroads, you find these large, robust nails, often several per side and end, driven from the outside, through the lid and into the structure below. Hammered in with force, creating a seal that would be exceptionally difficult, maybe impossible, to break from the inside. The pieces click into place with a sickening lurch. This wasn't about making a sturdy box for transport. This was about containment. This was about ensuring that whatever was inside stayed inside, It wasn't just one anomalous burial, it was a pattern, a custom, clearly practiced for generations. The sheer number of nails, the deliberate placement, this wasn't accidental. Imagine the anthropologist's careful field notes, initially filled with dry measurements and classifications, now containing scribbled question marks and exclamation points next to diagrams of splintered wood and rusted iron. Evidence of unusual fixation method on sarcophagi, they might write, using academic jargon to distance themselves from the chilling implication. But the implication is stark. These weren't just coffins, they were sealed vaults. A mainstream historical fact. Forensic anthropologists and archaeologists often study historical cemeteries and burial practices to understand past cultures, health, and social structures. Unusual burial methods, grave disturbances, or skeletal anomalies can provide crucial insights into everything from disease outbreaks to folk beliefs and rituals surrounding death. Finding evidence of deliberate, non-standard coffin fixation from the outside is definitely one of those unusual methods that would immediately raise questions. You or the anthropologist would start asking the local villagers about it, gently at first, but as you've already experienced, getting straight answers about the really deep, fearful stuff in a place like this is like trying to grab smoke. The elder you spoke to earlier, he might have been one of the few willing to speak openly, sensing perhaps that an outsider with no local ties was a safer confidant than a neighbor. Or maybe the anthropologist found someone else, a descendant of a family tasked with the grim duty, perhaps, or someone with a more historical bent who saw the old ways fading and felt a need to record them before they vanished completely. The stories would come out slowly in hushed tones, confirming the terrifying hypothesis derived from the nails. The sickness that plays tricks, the fear of stirring, the need for absolute finality. The discovery of the physical evidence, the nailed coffins themselves, would lend horrifying credibility to the whispered folklore, turning what might otherwise sound like superstitious nonsense into a documented, albeit chilling, historical practice. A quirky tidbit. While safety coffins with signaling devices were a product of the relatively modern fear of premature burial in the 18th and 19th centuries, older folklore from various cultures includes tales of using physical restraints or methods like staking or decapitation to prevent restless corpses from rising. The village's method of simply nailing the lid shut seems almost prosaic compared to some of the more gruesome folkloric countermeasures. Yet in its practical finality, it's arguably more terrifying if considered as a response to actual premature stirring. This is where the academic world grapples with the sheer visceral horror of it. You can analyze the types of nails, carbon date the wood, study the soil composition. But how do you quantify the fear that drove a community to perform such an act on their own dead, or perhaps they're not quite dead? How do you reconcile the image of a loving family with the knowledge that they might have participated in sealing a loved one into darkness while a flicker of life potentially remained? Historians still argue whether such extreme burial practices were genuinely widespread in certain isolated regions due to a confluence of specific local conditions, like a prevalent illness causing catatonic states and deep-seated folk fears, or if they were exceptionally rare, with documented cases potentially exaggerated or misinterpreted over time. Was this village an isolated anomaly, or were there others like it, their secrets never uncovered? The physical evidence you discovered makes it clear this wasn't just a story here. It was a brutal reality for a period of time. The discovery of the nailed coffins is the hinge point. It moves the story from the realm of local legend and whispered fears into the cold, hard light of archaeological fact. It validates the elders' words and gives concrete form to the abstract concept of taphophobia, taken to its most extreme, community-wide conclusion. And it opens up uncomfortable questions about the boundaries between life and death in times of limited knowledge, and the lengths communities will go to control the uncontrollable, even if it means committing acts that seem unspeakably cruel to modern sensibilities. This discovery wouldn't have happened overnight. It would have required careful, sensitive investigation, building trust with hesitant villagers, cross-referencing oral history with archaeological findings. It's a testament to the persistence of the researchers, and perhaps the villagers' eventual willingness to share their burden, that the story of the nailed coffins ever came to light. And now you know you've walked their paths, felt the weight of their fear, and seen the chilling physical evidence of their solution. The story isn't just about a strange, dark custom anymore. It's about the people, living and dead, who were bound by it. You've seen the nails, felt the oppressive weight of the villagers' fear, understood the chilling logic that led them to such an extreme measure. Now imagine the ripple effect as this secret, buried for generations, both literally and figuratively, begins to surface. The initial discovery, whether by a lone anthropologist or an archaeological team, is just the first tremor. What happens when the rest of the world that has moved on from such primal fears, learns about the village that nailed its dead, or perhaps not quite dead, into their coffins? It's not like it hit the national news overnight. You wouldn't have seen a splashy headline on CNN or a dramatic miniseries adaptation immediately, though honestly, someone in Hollywood is probably taking notes right now. The story of the nailed coffins would have begun its journey through more academic channels. The initial findings, meticulously documented by those who found the evidence, would first appear in scholarly papers, perhaps presented at niche conferences on historical archaeology or thanatology, the study of death and dying, which sounds like a fun dinner party topic, doesn't it? Imagine the scene: a slightly dusty lecture hall, a projection of archaeological diagrams showing those unsettling nail patterns, and a reserved academic calmly describing the evidence, while the audience of peers leans forward, a collective shiver running through them. This isn't abstract theory. This is concrete, physical proof of a deeply disturbing historical practice. The whispered tales you heard are suddenly backed up by rusted iron and splintered wood. From the academic world, the story would seep out. Perhaps a summary appears in a history magazine, or a journalist writing about unusual historical customs picks it up. It spreads slowly by word of mouth, through fascinated whispers, becoming a morbid curiosity. People are drawn to the macabre, aren't we? We can't help but peek into the darker corners of history, especially when it touches upon fundamental fears like being buried alive. Your brain, settling down for the night, might find this particularly sticky, like burrs on a wool blanket. Think about the perception. To the outside world, disconnected from the village's specific history and fear, the act of nailing coffins shut can sound utterly barbaric, almost medieval in its perceived cruelty. How could families do this to their own loved ones? Didn't they consider the possibility, however remote, that the person might still be clinging to life? The immediate reaction from a modern perspective is often one of judgment, tinged with horror. You might find yourself thinking, I can't imagine doing that. And thankfully, in the era of modern medicine and clear diagnostic criteria for death, you don't have to. But the academic study that followed the initial discovery would delve deeper, seeking context, seeking understanding. Anthropologists would return, perhaps with more specific questions, armed with the knowledge of the physical evidence. They would try to piece together the narrative you've already explored. The specific illness, the lack of medical knowledge, the isolation, the pervasive folklore, the communal decision-making under duress. They would talk to the oldest living villagers again, perhaps finding new individuals willing to share fragments of stories passed down through generations, tales of fear and grim necessity. Archaeologists might conduct more extensive excavations in the old graveyard, carefully uncovering more coffins from that specific period, documenting the variations in nailing patterns, trying to understand if the practice evolved or remained consistent over time. Were some coffins more heavily nailed than others? Did the practice correlate with specific periods or families? These dry, scientific questions are aimed at understanding the how and the when, trying to map the contours of a fear-driven ritual. A mainstream historical fact. The study of historical burial practices, known as mortuary archaeology, is a well-established field. By examining how people treated their dead, archaeologists can infer a great deal about their social structure, religious beliefs, economic status, and yes, even their fears. Finding a widespread, consistent practice like the nailing of coffins in a specific time period and location provides incredibly valuable, albeit disturbing, data for understanding that community. The story, once it's out, invites comparison. People would inevitably link it to the broader, more well-known historical fear of premature burial that swept through Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, leading to the invention of safety coffins with bells and flags. But as you know, this village's practice is different. It wasn't about providing a chance of rescue, it was about preventing exit. It was a proactive measure driven by deep-seated, localized dread, not a reactive, hopeful one. It's the difference between installing a panic button and cementing the door shut. The village itself would likely experience a complex mix of reactions. Pride in their heritage? Unlikely. More likely shame, a desire to distance themselves from a brutal past, or perhaps a quiet resignation, seeing their old fears exposed to a world that couldn't possibly understand. They might become a minor point of interest for dark tourists or academics, their quiet isolation disrupted by outsiders poking into painful history. The elders who shared their stories might regret it, or perhaps feel a sense of relief that the truth is finally out, albeit viewed through a potentially unsympathetic modern lens. Imagine the discussions among historians and anthropologists studying this case. They debate the ethics of the practice, of course, but also the reliability of oral histories versus archaeological evidence. Did the villagers exaggerate their fear in the stories? Or was the physical evidence of the nailing ritual proof that the fear was even more profound than the tale suggested? How do you balance understanding a historical community's actions within their own context against modern moral judgments? It's a tricky tightrope walk, isn't it? Judging the past by the standards of the present rarely leads to true understanding. A quirky tidbit. In some European folk traditions concerning vampires or revenants, methods like staking, decapitation, or placing heavy stones on the grave were used to prevent the corpse from leaving the grave. While the village's practice of nailing coffins shut wasn't explicitly linked to folklore about the undead, in the same way the underlying fear of a stirring, mobile corpse and the need for absolute physical containment shares a thematic resonance with these darker, supernatural folk beliefs, even if the village's explanation was framed around a specific, non-supernatural illness. The story serves as a stark reminder of just how terrifying life could be in a world without reliable medicine or clear scientific understanding of death. It highlights the power of fear to shape communal behavior and rituals, driving people to actions that seem shocking to us now, but felt like necessary protection to them then. It also underlines the fragility of the boundary between life and death in past centuries, where the line was often blurrier than we care to imagine. Historians still argue whether the widespread fear of premature burial in the 18th and 19th centuries, which spawned the safety coffin craze, was largely a product of sensationalized literature and urban legends, or if instances of mistaken death and subsequent awakening were genuinely common enough to warrant such widespread anxiety and the development of safety measures. The village's practice, while geographically isolated and stemming from a specific local condition, lends some weight to the idea that the fear, even if amplified elsewhere by fiction, had roots in terrifying potential realities for some communities. The discovery and subsequent sharing of the village's grim history don't just add a footnote to the study of death rituals. They provide a chilling, visceral case study in how societies cope with uncertainty and fear, how they create their own rules and rituals when external knowledge is insufficient, and how deeply unsettling history can be when you scratch just beneath the surface of seemingly simple facts like burial practices. It ensures that the villagers' quiet dread, etched into the very wood and nails of their coffins, is not forgotten, even as their isolation fades and their old fears become mere historical footnotes for a world that sleeps more soundly. You've followed the story from its whispered origins, through the grim necessity born of fear and isolation, the gradual fading of memory, and the eventual archaeological rediscovery that brought it blinking back into the light. Now you're contemplating the legacy of that village and its chilling practice. How does a history so dark, so deeply rooted in primal fear, resonate in a world that feels utterly disconnected from such things? The initial reaction, as we touched upon, might be revulsion or judgment. But the academic work, the careful layering of context, the specific illness, the diagnostic uncertainty, the communal desperation begins to shift the perception. It moves from monstrous cruelty to a terrifying glimpse into life before modern medicine. The villagers aren't necessarily seen as sadists, but as people trapped by their circumstances and their own overwhelming fear. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from anyone listening, grateful they weren't born into that specific time and place. The village itself, if it still exists, carries this legacy in its bones. It might become a minor curiosity, a place where people whisper about the old ways, perhaps with a mix of embarrassment and a strange, detached pride in having a unique, albeit disturbing history. Local legends might be retold with new details unearthed by the research, or perhaps deliberately suppressed, the community wanting to move on from a past that feels like a weight. Imagine being a teenager in that village today, knowing your ancestors literally nailed people into boxes because they were scared of them waking up. Talk about awkward family history projects. The story becomes a powerful case study not just for mortuary archaeology or medical history, but for understanding human behavior under extreme duress. It highlights the capacity for ordinary people, bound by community and shared fear, to enact practices that appear horrific from a distance, but felt rational, perhaps even necessary when living through them. It forces you to confront the uncomfortable question: what extreme measures might you take if stripped of modern safety nets, faced with an unknown, terrifying threat, and surrounded by neighbors equally desperate for a solution? A mainstream historical fact. Fear of contagion and uncertainty surrounding death were incredibly powerful forces throughout history, shaping numerous rituals and practices far beyond this single village. Epidemics like the Black Death, for example, led to mass burials, rapid disposal of bodies, and often a breakdown of traditional mourning rituals, all driven by the desperate need to contain the perceived threat. The village's story, while specific to its circumstances, is a microcosm of this broader historical theme: fear of the body, fear of death, and fear of what might happen if death wasn't final. The legacy also lies in the lessons it offers about historical interpretation. It reminds us to look beyond the shocking act itself and delve into the complex web of factors that motivated it. It teaches humility when judging the past. What seems barbaric to us might have been a pragmatic, albeit grim, solution to an insurmountable problem for them. It's easy to shake our heads from the comfort of the 21st century, isn't it? But put yourself back there in that isolation, with that fear gripping your heart, and the world looks very different. The story serves as a stark illustration of medical progress. The very uncertainty about the boundary between life and death that drove the nailing practice is almost unimaginable today in places with access to modern medical diagnosis. We have clear criteria for death, sophisticated equipment, and widespread medical knowledge that, while not eliminating all fears, certainly removes the kind of terrifying ambiguity that plagued that village. This is perhaps the most comforting aspect of the story for you tonight. The knowledge that this specific fear, in this specific manifestation, is largely a relic of the past, thanks to centuries of scientific advancement. You don't have to worry about anyone mistaking your nap for something more permanent, though a particularly deep sleep might give someone a brief scare. Just saying. A quirky tidbit. While not about nailing coffins, the fear of premature burial in the 19th century led to patents for safety coffins that incorporated mechanisms like bells, flags, or even escape hatches connected to the surface. Some were quite elaborate, including breathing tubes and food storage. While likely never widely used in practice, the sheer ingenuity of these inventions, driven by the popular fear, shows just how far people would go to alleviate the anxiety of being buried alive. A fear that our village ancestors sought to contain rather than prevent the outcome of. Reflecting on this history allows us to appreciate the tangible benefits of things we take for granted: public health knowledge, access to doctors, clear medical standards. It also reminds us of the power of narrative, how a story, whether whispered legend or archaeological report, can bring a forgotten fear back to life, allowing us to learn from it. The nailed coffins, once a desperate secret, become a silent historical text, legible to those willing to look closely and listen without immediate judgment. Historians still argue whether the specific medical condition described in the village's oral history was a distinct, recognizable disease or a local interpretation of symptoms that might correspond to several different conditions known today. Pinpointing the exact ailment is difficult without historical medical records or biological samples, leaving the precise trigger for their extreme fear open to some interpretation and debate among medical historians and anthropologists. The legacy of the village isn't just in the objects found in the ground, but in the questions it raises about humanity. It prompts us to consider the limits of rationality when faced with overwhelming fear, the ethics of historical judgment, and the profound impact that lack of knowledge can have on a community's actions. It ensures that the quiet desperation of those who lived and died there, and the grim finality they imposed, continues to echo softly through the corridors of history, a quiet, unsettling reminder of how different things used to be. The nails might be rusted, the wood turned to dust, but the story, and the fear it embodies, remains, a dark thread in the rich tapestry of the human past. Perhaps just the kind of unsettling thought to help your brain finally wind down tonight.